There is a city buried under the fields of southern Illinois that was, for a brief window of time, larger than London, not a village, not a settlement. A city with neighborhoods and plazas and markets and temples and a population that archaeologists now estimate reached somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people at its height. A city built without metal tools, without the wheel, without horses, without written records in any script we have decoded, and yet a city that was laid out with a precision that still confuses the engineers who study it today. Its central pyramid, if you can call it that, is made entirely of packed earth, and it covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is not a metaphor. This is not an exaggeration offered to make an ancient people seem more impressive than they were. This is simply a fact that appears in peer-reviewed journals and university textbooks, and the reports of government archaeologists who have spent careers measuring and excavating and carbon dating the structures that survive. And yet almost nobody knows it. Almost nobody can name the culture that built this place. Almost nobody can point to it on a map and explain what it meant, and who made it and where they went, and why the world forgot them so completely that for 2 centuries after European contact, the people living near those enormous earthen mounds told anyone who asked that they had been built by a lost race, a vanished people, some group that existed before history and left no descendants. That lie, the idea that the mounds were the work of a mysterious lost race that had nothing to do with the indigenous people of North America, is one of the most consequential fabrications in the history of this continent. It shaped policy, it shaped law, it shaped the stories that were used to justify the removal of entire nations from their homelands. If the mounds were built by a lost race, then the people currently living on that land had no ancestral claim to it. They were just the next group to arrive, no more rooted to the soil than the Europeans who came after them. The mound builder myth was not just bad archaeology. It was a political tool, and it worked for a very long time. But here is the thing. The mounds did not disappear. The people who built them did not vanish. The knowledge of what those earthworks meant, and how they were constructed and what they were aligned to, and who commissioned them and who maintained them across generations, much of that knowledge survived, carried forward in oral traditions and ceremonies and relationships with the land that persists to this day. What disappeared was not the builders. What disappeared was the willingness of the dominant culture to listen to them. This is the story of what was here before the story we were taught. It is a story that stretches from the bayous of Louisiana to the boreal forests of Ontario, from the river valleys of Ohio to the wind-scoured plains of Manitoba. It is a story of engineering and astronomy and philosophy and trade and political complexity that rivaled anything happening in the contemporary world at the same time. And it is a story that is still being suppressed, still being minimized, still being told in ways that strip the builders of their full humanity and reduce their achievements to curiosities rather than recognizing them for what they were, the foundations of civilizations that shaped this continent for thousands of years. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Let us start with the thing that nobody tells you in school. The mound-building cultures of North America were not one culture. They were not one people. They were not one era. They were an interconnected family of traditions and exchange networks and ceremonial practices that developed across roughly 4,000 years of continuous innovation, spread across a geographic area larger than Europe, and produced earthwork constructions that are measurable in the millions of cubic feet of moved earth. This was not a project. This was a civilization, or rather, a series of overlapping civilizations, each one building on the ideas and trade routes and ceremonial knowledge of the one that came before. The earliest mounds we have found so far are in Louisiana, at a place called Watson Brake, and they were constructed approximately 5,400 years ago. That is older than Stonehenge. That is older than the earliest pyramids of Egypt. The people who built Watson Brake were hunter-gatherers with a complex seasonal economy. They were not settled farmers. They did not have surplus grain stored in granaries. They did not have a recognizable political hierarchy with a king or a priest ruler who commanded their labor. And yet 11 earthen mounds connected by a low ridge in a roughly oval pattern rise out of that Louisiana landscape, and they were built deliberately, and they were maintained for at least 500 years, and the earth that went into them was carefully chosen and carefully placed, and the whole complex is aligned in ways that researchers are still working to understand. 5,000 years ago, people in Louisiana were building monumental earthwork complexes. This is not a footnote. This is not a minor discovery. This overturns a foundational assumption of American archaeology, the assumption that mound building was a relatively late development that arose only after agriculture made it possible to feed a specialized labor force. Watson Brake says no. People were doing this long before anyone in North America was farming in any systematic way. They were doing it because they chose to, because the earthworks served purposes that their society valued enough to invest enormous collective effort in maintaining. We do not know exactly what those purposes were. We can make educated guesses based on what we know about later mound-building cultures, and about the ways earthworks function in the landscape, and about the astronomical alignments that keep showing up at site after site after site. But we are guessing, and anyone who tells you they know for certain is not being honest with you. What we do know is that Watson Brake was not an isolated experiment. About 150 miles away, at a place called Poverty Point, another monumental earthwork complex was under construction roughly 3,500 years ago. Poverty Point is almost impossible to fully grasp from the ground. You have to see it from the air to understand what was built there. 6 concentric semicircular ridges, each one several feet high and several feet wide, arranged in a pattern centered on a large bird-shaped mound that rises about 70 feet above the surrounding plain. The concentric ridges extend for 3/4 of a mile from one end to the other. The total earthwork, counting all the ridges and mounds and plazas and associated features, covers an area of almost a square mile. And it was built, according to the most recent analysis, very quickly, not over centuries, not in slow increments that you would expect from a gradual accumulation of effort. Recent research published in the journal Nature suggests that the main platform mound at Poverty Point was constructed in less than 90 days, maybe in as few as 30. Think about what that means. To move the volume of earth represented by that mound in 30 to 90 days, you need a very large number of people working in a highly organized way. You need logistics. You need someone planning where the earth comes from and where it goes, and in what sequence and with what tools and fed by what food supply. You need something that looks a lot like institutional organization, which is not what we expect from a people that most textbooks still describe as mobile foragers living in small family bands. Poverty Point was not a village. It was not a regional settlement. Poverty Point was a place where people from an enormous geographic area came together, probably on a seasonal or ceremonial basis, to do something that mattered to them, enough to organize 10,000 or 20,000 people into a labor force capable of moving millions of cubic feet of earth in the span of a single season. The trade goods found at Poverty Point come from hundreds of miles away. Copper from the Great Lakes region, galena from Missouri and Illinois, steatite from the Appalachian Highlands, jasper from Indiana, magnetite from Arkansas and Missouri. These are not local materials. These are materials that required extensive trade networks to acquire, networks that connected Poverty Point to communities spread across much of eastern North America at least 3,500 years ago. This is the beginning of a pattern that will repeat itself across the entire mound-building tradition. The mounds are not isolated achievements. The mounds are nodes in a network. Every major mound complex sits at the intersection of trade routes, communication lines, and ceremonial relationships that connected it to dozens or hundreds of other communities across vast distances. The mounds mark the places where those networks converged. They are monuments to connection as much as to anything else. By the time the culture we call Adena was building mounds in the Ohio Valley around 3,000 years ago, that pattern was firmly established. Adena earthworks are found across Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, and they range from small burial mounds barely larger than a raised garden bed to enormous conical structures that can rise more than 60 feet above the surrounding landscape. The Grave Creek Mound in present-day West Virginia, one of the largest Adena burial mounds, contains an estimated 60,000 tons of earth. It was built in stages over centuries, each generation adding to what the previous generation had created, maintaining a connection to the ancestors and to the ceremonial landscape that the mound occupied. Adena is a burial culture, meaning that much of what we know about the people who created it comes from what they placed. The dead were interred with objects made from materials that came from far away. Copper ear spools and breastplates, sheets of mica cut into geometric shapes, freshwater pearls by the hundreds, carved stone pipes with animal effigies, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico. The people buried in these graves had access to the products of a continent-wide trade system. They were not isolated. They were not cut off from the larger world. They were participants in a network of exchange and relationship that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. And here is where the Canadian angle becomes essential, because that network did not stop at the border. There is no natural geographic feature that corresponds to the 49th parallel. The rivers flow north and south and east and west without consulting modern political maps. The trade routes followed the rivers and the lake shores, and the forest paths that connected community to community across thousands of miles, and those routes ran straight through what is now Ontario and Manitoba and Quebec, and the Maritime Provinces and British Columbia. The mound-building world was not an American world. It was a North American world, and the portion of it that now falls within Canadian borders is a story that Canadian education almost never tells. In southwestern Ontario, in the area around Rice Lake and the Trent River system, there are mounds. Not metaphorical mounds, not natural landscape features mistaken for earthworks. Actual intentional earthen structures built by people of the Princess Point and early Ontario Iroquoian tradition who were participating in the broader exchange networks of the Hopewell cultural sphere. The Serpent Mounds Provincial Park near Peterborough protects a group of earthworks that includes a large serpentine mound nearly 200 meters long and several conical burial mounds associated with it. This complex dates to roughly 2,000 years ago, placing it squarely within the Hopewell period, the cultural tradition that represents perhaps the most spectacular expression of the mound-building world. Hopewell is not a single society. Hopewell is a name archaeologists gave to a shared ceremonial and artistic tradition that appears at sites spread across the eastern half of North America from roughly 200 BCE to roughly 500 CE. Within that tradition, there are regional variants and local expressions and community-specific practices, but there are also remarkably consistent elements that appear at Hopewell sites from Florida to Michigan, from Kansas to New York. The distinctive Hopewell artistic style, with its cut-out mica silhouettes and its hammered copper representations of birds and animals and human hands, appears at sites that are separated by hundreds of miles. The same ceremonial objects, or objects made according to the same ceremonial specifications, turn up in burial contexts across an enormous geographic range. This is not coincidence. This is coordination. This is the material evidence of a shared cultural and ceremonial system maintained across generations and across vast distances. The earthworks themselves are where Hopewell becomes almost impossible to comprehend without seeing them. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, which represent the largest set of geometric earthworks anywhere in the ancient world, cover an area of over 4 square miles. They consist of enormous circles and octagonals and parallel walls of earth connecting different sections of the complex, and the whole thing is aligned with extraordinary precision to the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, the point in the moon's cycle when it rises and sets at its most extreme northern and southern positions on the horizon. That alignment is not approximate. It is not within a few degrees. It is exact within the measurement precision of modern surveying equipment, achieved by people working with wooden stakes and cords and the accumulated astronomical knowledge of a tradition that had been tracking celestial cycles for centuries or millennia. Let that sink in. 2,000 years ago, in what is now Ohio, people laid out a geometric earthwork complex covering 4 square miles that encodes the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle with a precision that required sustained, multi-generational astronomical observation and a geometric planning capacity that modern engineers have described as remarkable. The Great Circle at Newark is a perfect circle, a quarter-mile in diameter. The octagon, a shape with 8 sides connected to the circle by a corridor of parallel walls, is aligned to the lunar extremes with a precision that could not be accidental. This is not impressive for its time. This is impressive by any standard at any time. And there are dozens of these complexes. The Hopewell ceremonial earthworks that were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2023 include 8 separate earthwork groups in the Scioto and Paint Creek valleys of southern Ohio, and those 8 groups represent only a fraction of the total number of Hopewell earthwork sites that once existed in the Ohio Valley and its surrounding region. Historical accounts from the early 19th century describe hundreds of mounds and earthwork enclosures that have since been plowed under or built over or eroded into invisibility by 2 centuries of intensive agriculture, development. What survives is the remnant of a much larger monumental landscape that once covered the entire central Ohio region. The scale of what was destroyed, deliberately and carelessly both, is one of the great cultural losses in the history of this continent. In 1848, Ephraim George Squire and Edwin Hamilton Davis published a survey of ancient monuments of the Mississippi Valley that documented hundreds of earthwork sites, many of which no longer exist today. Their survey was the first systematic attempt to catalogue the mound building remains of eastern North America, and it was produced at a moment when industrialization and agricultural expansion were actively destroying the very sites it documented. Reading Squire and Davis today is a haunting experience, because you are looking at descriptions and drawings of structures that will never be seen again, structures that were still intact when those men visited them in the 1840s, but were ploughed flat within a generation of their publication. What replaced them? Cornfields, mostly. Suburban subdivisions, railroad grades, golf courses. The octagon mound at Newark is still there, but it is surrounded by a golf course, and the golf course has priority. You can walk the earthworks on certain days when the golf course allows visitors, but most of the time the most precisely aligned astronomical earthwork in the ancient world is a golf fairway, and the irony of that has not been lost on the Licking County community or on the indigenous nations who have been advocating for a different relationship with that land. But let us not get ahead of ourselves, because the story gets bigger before it gets to the question of what we do with it now. The story gets to Cahokia. Cahokia is the name archaeologists gave to the site across the Mississippi River from present-day St. Louis, Missouri, in what is now Collinsville, Illinois. The name comes from the Cahokia people, a subtribe of the Illiniwet Confederacy who were living in the area when French explorers arrived in the late 17th century, but those people were not the builders of the earthwork city. The builders lived there between roughly 900 CE and 1300 CE, and they called themselves something we do not know, because they left no written records, and the names by which they might have referred to themselves have not survived in any form we can currently access. Archaeologists call the culture Mississippian, after the great river that ran through its heartland, and Cahokia was the largest Mississippian city, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, the largest urban center in North America until the early 19th century, when Philadelphia finally surpassed it. The numbers are staggering in themselves, but they do not convey the reality. Let me try to give you the reality. Monk's Mound, the central pyramid of Cahokia, rises in 4 terraces to a height of about 100 feet above the surrounding floodplain. Its base covers 14 acres. To build it required moving approximately 22 million cubic feet of earth, all of it carried in baskets on the backs of workers. Because there were no wheeled vehicles and no draft animals in pre-Columbian North America north of Mexico, the mound was not built all at once. It was added to over centuries, each phase of construction adding another layer, another terrace, raising it higher toward the sky. At the top, in the final phase of construction, there was a large wooden building that may have served as a throne room or a temple or a combination of the two, the residence of a ruler whose authority extended across a significant portion of the central Mississippi Valley. Around Monk's Mound, in the planned city that archaeologists have been excavating since the mid-20th century, there were at least 120 additional mounds. Some of them were platform mounds like Monk's Mound, flat-topped structures that served as the bases for elite residences or public buildings. Some of them were conical burial mounds, the graves of important individuals interred with the objects that marked their status and their relationships and their roles in the ritual life of the community. Some of them were ridge-top mounds, long, narrow structures whose exact function is still debated. The whole complex was organized around a grand plaza, a large, flat, open space, about 50 acres in size, that sat at the foot of Monk's Mound and served as the ceremonial heart of the city. The city was surrounded by a wooden palisade, a defensive wall of closely spaced logs that enclosed the central precincts and the elite residential areas. The wall required 20,000 logs to construct and was rebuilt at least 4 times over the course of Cahokia's occupation. Outside the palisade, the residential neighborhood spread out across the American Bottom, the broad floodplain that made this location so favorable for intensive agriculture. The houses were rectangular, built of wall trench construction with thatched roofs, arranged in rows along the axes established by the city's planners. There were craft production areas where artisans made pottery and worked stone and shaped copper into the distinctive Mississippian ceremonial objects. There were storage facilities and market areas and the infrastructure of a complex urban community. The population at Cahokia's height, probably in the 11th century CE, is estimated at between 10,000 and 20,000 people in the immediate urban core, with another 10,000 to 30,000 in the surrounding hinterland communities that were integrated into the Cahokian political and economic system. For comparison, in 1100 CE, London had a population of roughly 10,000 to 15,000 people. Paris was slightly larger. Most European cities at that time were considerably smaller than Cahokia. This was a major urban center by any global standard of the period, and it developed entirely without the inputs that standard models of urban development say are necessary. No writing, no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals, no contact with the civilizations of Mesoamerica, despite what generations of racist archaeology suggested about the mounds requiring an external, civilized origin. The racist archaeology deserves a moment of direct address, because it shaped the field for over a century and its effects are still visible today. From the first European contact with the mounds, a significant portion of European and Euro-American writers and scholars insisted that they could not have been built by the ancestors of the people then living near them. The logic was circular and nakedly prejudiced. Indigenous people, in this view, were by definition incapable of monumental architecture. Therefore, the mounds must have been built by someone else. The someone else varied by author and era. Sometimes it was the mound builders, a hypothetical lost white race who had been displaced or exterminated by the barbaric ancestors of the current indigenous population. Sometimes it was the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Sometimes it was the Welsh, following a legend about a prince named Madoc who sailed to America in the 12th century. Sometimes it was survivors of Atlantis. Sometimes it was ancient Phoenicians or Egyptians or any other Mediterranean civilization that might have crossed the Atlantic and established colonies that left mounds behind when they departed or died. These theories were not fringe ideas held by cranks. They were mainstream positions argued by educated men in respected publications and cited in political debates about Indian policy. Thomas Jefferson, who was an unusually careful observer of material culture by the standards of his time, and who actually excavated a burial mound on his Virginia property in what may be the first scientific archaeological excavation in American history, rejected the lost race theory. But many of his contemporaries did not, and the theory retained popular and political currency well into the 20th century. As late as the 1830s, the position of the United States government was effectively that the mounds could not have been built by the ancestors of the contemporary Native American nations being removed from their homelands, and this position was used as a justification for the removal itself. The man most responsible for demolishing the lost race theory on scientific grounds was Cyrus Thomas, an archaeologist working for the Bureau of American Ethnology, who spent years in the 1880s conducting systematic excavations at mound sites across the eastern United States. Thomas's conclusion, published in 1894, was unambiguous. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the contemporary Native American peoples, and there was no evidence whatsoever of a separate, earlier, lost race. His evidence was overwhelming. The artifacts found in the mounds were culturally continuous with the material culture of the surrounding indigenous communities. The oral traditions of multiple native nations included specific accounts of mound building and mound use. The construction techniques used in the mounds were consistent with the known technologies of pre-Columbian North America. There was nothing mysterious about the origin of the mounds except the question of why educated people had found the true explanation so unacceptable for so long. The answer to that question, of course, was not a mystery at all. It was politics. Acknowledging that the mounds were built by the ancestors of the current indigenous population would have required acknowledging that those people had a deep, continuous, sophisticated relationship with the land that Europeans had seized. It would have undermined the legal and moral framework that justified the seizure. It was more convenient, in every sense, to insist on a lost race. But let us get back to the story itself, because the story is so much larger than the suppression, and the suppression only makes sense once you understand the scale of what it was suppressing. The Mississippian world at its height in the 12th and 13th centuries was a system of chiefdoms and towns and ceremonial centers spread across the entire southeastern quadrant of North America, from the Gulf Coast to the Ohio Valley, from the Atlantic coastal plain to the Great Plains margin. It was not a unified empire with a single capital and a single ruler. It was a network of related polities linked by shared ceremonial practices, long-distance trade, intermarriage among elites, and the common thread of a religious and cosmological system that archaeologists call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, or, more recently, the Mississippian Ideological Interaction Sphere. The names are clunky, but the reality they describe is remarkable. A shared spiritual and ceremonial tradition expressed in a distinctive artistic style that appears at sites from Florida to Wisconsin, from North Carolina to Kansas. The imagery of the Mississippian Ideological Interaction Sphere is dominated by certain recurring motifs. Winged human figures, sometimes called birdmen, depicted in postures that suggest flight or transformation. Serpents with wings or horns or feathered crests. Weeping eye symbols that appear to represent rain or tears or the connection between the sky world and the underworld. Hands with eyes in their palms. Skulls and skull rack imagery that connect to the importance of ancestor veneration in Mississippian religion. These images are not decorative. They are the visual language of a cosmological system, a way of expressing relationships between the human world, the spirit world, the world above, and the world below that was shared, with local variations across the entire Mississippian cultural sphere, and that sphere extended into Canada. Not in the form of large platform mounds or elaborate civic plazas, because the ecological and demographic conditions of the Canadian Shield and the northern forests did not support the same kind of intensive maize agriculture that fueled Cahokia's growth, but in the form of trade goods, artistic influences, ceremonial practices, and human relationships that connected the peoples of what is now Canada to the broader world of the mound builders, in ways that are still being traced by archaeologists and by the indigenous communities who carry these histories in their own traditions. The copper is the most dramatic evidence. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area, and its shorelines and shallows and the rocky outcrops of its surrounding landscape contain some of the largest deposits of native copper ever found anywhere on Earth. Native copper is copper that occurs in metallic form, not bound up in ore that requires smelting to extract, but as actual masses of metal that can be hammered directly into tools and ornaments without any high-temperature metallurgical process. The deposits around Lake Superior were known to the indigenous peoples of the region for at least 7,000 years, based on the radiocarbon dates associated with the earliest mining evidence found there. And the copper they extracted from those deposits traveled everywhere. Copper objects from Lake Superior have been found at archaeological sites across a geographic range that is almost impossible to map without a very large piece of paper. They appear in Poverty Point, at the southern end of the Mississippi system, 3,500 years ago. They appear in Hopewell burial mounds in Ohio, in Indiana, in Illinois, in Wisconsin, in Michigan. They appear in Mississippian contexts from Alabama to Iowa. They appear in the burial sites of peoples whose names we do not know, in contexts that suggest the copper itself carried ceremonial and political significance far beyond its utility as a material. Copper was not valued in pre-Columbian North America primarily because it was useful for making tools, although it was used for tools. Copper was valued because it was bright, and it transformed under the hammer, and it could be worked into shapes of supernatural power, and because the act of obtaining it from the shores of the greatest of the great inland seas carried, meaning that we can only partially reconstruct from the archaeological record. The mining operations on Lake Superior were not casual, they were systematic. The ancient copper mines on Isle Royale, the largest island in Lake Superior, show evidence of organized extraction on a significant scale. Miners used stone hammers to break the copper loose from the rock, and the number of those hammers found at extraction sites is in the hundreds of thousands. The pits dug to access copper deposits go down many feet into the bedrock. This was not opportunistic surface collection. This was mining, planned and sustained over centuries or millennia by communities that organized their labor toward the extraction and distribution of a material that the entire continent apparently wanted. The people who controlled the Lake Superior copper deposits controlled something valuable, and that control translated into political and ceremonial influence that radiated outward through the trade networks. The communities around the shores of Lake Superior and in the broader Great Lakes region were participants in the mound-building world, not as peripheral contributors, but as essential nodes in the system. Without the copper, the Hopewell ceremonial tradition looks quite different. Without the copper, the prestige economy that drove the construction of the Great Ohio Earthworks is harder to explain. The copper was the blood of the system, and the Great Lakes was its heart. This means that the Canadian Shield, the rugged ancient rock of the Canadian North that most people think of as an obstacle to development and habitation rather than a center of civilization, was in fact one of the most important regions in the pre-Columbian world. Not because of its own mound-building tradition, although earthworks of various kinds do appear in Ontario and elsewhere in Canada, but because the resources of that landscape, the copper and the furs and the wild rice and the fish and the relationship networks built around accessing and exchanging those resources, made it central to the economic and ceremonial life of the broader mound-building world for thousands of years. And yet when Canadians learn about pre-Columbian North America, if they learn about it at all, they are generally told about small bands of nomadic hunters and gatherers who lived lightly on the land and left few traces. The copper mines are not in the curriculum. The trade networks are not in the curriculum. The relationship between the Great Lakes region and the monumental earthwork cultures of the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi Valley is not in the curriculum. The story of how the North fed the South and the South fed the North across thousands of years of sustained exchange is not in the curriculum. Why not? The question is worth asking directly. Why does Canadian education, which is generally more progressive about Indigenous issues than American education in certain respects, still manage to present the pre-Columbian history of its own territory as essentially a story of small-scale, technologically simple societies that existed largely in isolation from each other and from the broader currents of North American history? Part of the answer is the same as the American answer. Acknowledging the complexity and sophistication of the pre-Columbian world requires a more complicated reckoning with what was taken and how it was taken. Part of the answer is genuinely archaeological. The material evidence is harder to see in the forested North than on the treeless plains or in the plowed fields of the Midwest, and the research infrastructure for studying it has historically been thinner. And part of the answer, frankly, is that the story has not been told in ways that reach the general public, and the people who carry this history in their own traditions have not always had the platform or the institutional support to share it. Let us talk about Serpent Mound, the one in Ontario, not the more famous one in Ohio, because the Ontario site is the one that most Canadians have never heard of, and that does not appear in any Canadian history course I am aware of. Despite being one of the most significant earthwork sites in the country, and one of the most eloquent physical testimonies to the reach of the mound-building world into the territory now claimed by Canada, the Serpent Mounds near Peterborough, Ontario, are located on the north shore of Rice Lake in the Trent Severn waterway system. There are 9 earthen mounds in the complex, including one large sinuous mound about 50 meters long that traces the shape of a serpent, and 8 smaller oval mounds in a cluster near the serpent's head. The complex was created approximately 2,000 years ago by people of the Point Peninsula culture, a tradition of the Upper Great Lakes region that shared many characteristics with the broader Hopewell cultural sphere to the south. The burials found in the mounds contained objects made from materials that came from far away: copper from Lake Superior, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, silver and lead from sources to the west. The people buried here were connected to a continental trade network, and they were building earthworks in a style that connects them to the broader tradition of mound building that was flourishing in the Ohio Valley at exactly the same time. Most Canadians who know about mounds at all think of them as something that happened in the American South and Midwest, something foreign, something that belongs to another country's story. But Rice Lake, Ontario is not far from Toronto. It is not in some remote wilderness at the edge of the known world. It is in the heart of the most densely populated region of Canada, 2 hours from one of the largest cities on the continent, and the earthworks there are 2,000 years old, and they connect the history of that landscape directly to the great mound-building tradition of the continent. The same is true of the medicine wheel sites in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Medicine wheels are large circular patterns made of stones, sometimes with spokes radiating outward from a central cairn, sometimes aligned to astronomical features. They are found across the northern plains from the Dakotas to Alberta, and the Majorville Medicine Wheel in Alberta is one of the oldest continuously used ceremonial sites in the world, with a history of use extending back approximately 5,000 years. The medicine wheels are not mounds in the strict sense of the word, but they are part of the same broader tradition of deliberate landscape modification for ceremonial purposes that characterizes the mound-building world, and they represent the northern expression of a way of relating to the land that is connected to everything happening in the south. The story of why the great mound cities declined and what happened to their populations is one of the most debated questions in North American archaeology. And the debate itself reveals something important about the assumptions archaeologists bring to their work. For a long time, the dominant narrative was collapse. The mound cities, particularly Cahokia, experienced a dramatic collapse, caused by some combination of environmental degradation, overpopulation, political instability, and possibly prolonged drought. The people scattered. The city was abandoned. The tradition ended. This narrative has a satisfying arc, and it allows the story to end before European contact, which is convenient because it means the decline of the mound cities has nothing to do with colonization. But the evidence does not actually support a clean collapse narrative. What the evidence shows is a transformation. The large nucleated urban centers like Cahokia did decline in the 14th and 15th centuries, probably due to a combination of factors including climate change associated with the onset of the Little Ice Age, agricultural failures, and possibly the kind of political and social instability that tends to accompany rapid demographic change. But the people did not disappear. They dispersed into smaller communities, reorganized their political structures, adapted their ceremonial practices, and continued to build mounds and maintain ceremonial landscapes and participate in long-distance trade networks right up until European contact in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Natchez people of the lower Mississippi Valley were still building temple mounds and maintaining a complex chiefdom organization with a divine ruler called the Great Sun when French explorers encountered them in the late 17th century. The Choctaw and Cherokee and Creek and Chickasaw and other peoples of the Southeast were building mounds and using them for ceremonial and political purposes when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century. The Osage and other peoples of the central Mississippi Valley maintained oral traditions and ceremonial practices directly connected to the Mississippian world. The mound builders did not disappear. The mound builders became the people who the Europeans met, and the Europeans, committed to a narrative in which the mound cities were ruins of a lost and greater civilization, refused to make the connection. The case of the Osage is instructive. The Osage are a Siouan-speaking people who lived in the central Ozark Highland and adjacent areas at the time of European contact, and whose oral traditions describe a cosmological system that connects directly to the imagery of the Mississippian ideological interaction sphere. The Osage creation narrative, the Wajajay oral tradition as preserved and shared by Osage scholars, describes the organization of the cosmos in terms of above and below, sky people and earth people, the division of the world into moieties that mirror the Mississippian artistic preoccupation with the relationship between the upper world and the lower world, the Osage clan system, the ceremonial bundle tradition, the symbolic geography of the Osage world as it appears in their oral literature, all echo themes and images that appear in the archaeological record of the Mississippian period. This is not a coincidence or an analogy. The Osage are the descendants of people who participated in the Mississippian world, who inherited its cosmological framework, who preserved its essential insights in oral traditions that survived the destruction of the physical landscape. The mounds are gone, many of them, but the ideas that built the mounds are still here, carried by communities that the larger culture has systematically refused to recognize as the intellectual and spiritual heirs of one of the great civilizational traditions of the ancient world. The same pattern appears across the board. The Muskogee Creek people of the Southeast maintain oral traditions and ceremonial practices that are direct continuations of the Mississippian world. Their square ground ceremonies, their clan system, their political organization, their ceremonial calendar, all reflect the imprint of a tradition that goes back to the great mound cities. The Choctaw maintain specific oral traditions about the Nani Waya Mound in Mississippi, which they regard as their place of origin, a site that connects their identity directly to the earthwork tradition. The Cherokee have traditions about the function of mounds as ceremonial and political centers. The Ho-Chunk and Menominee and other peoples of the Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi regions have traditions that connect them to the Hopewell period and to the earthwork landscapes of the Upper Midwest. These are not peripheral details. These are the central evidence. The descendants of the mound builders have been telling anyone who would listen that the mounds are their inheritance, that the tradition is continuous, that there is no lost race and there was never a mystery about who built these things. The mystery was manufactured by people who needed there to be a mystery. Let us spend some time with the astronomy, because the astronomical knowledge encoded in the earthworks is one of the dimensions that gets the least attention in mainstream accounts, and that reveals most clearly the depth of intellectual sophistication that the mound builders brought to their work. We have already talked about the Newark earthworks, and their alignment to the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle. But that is just one example of a pattern that appears at mound sites across the continent. The High Bank Works in Ohio, another Hopewell earthwork complex, shares the same octagonal geometry as the Newark octagon and is aligned to the same lunar extremes, a fact that takes on additional significance when you realize that the two sites are about 60 miles apart. They share a geometric and astronomical design language, while being separated by a full day's travel. This is not two communities independently arriving at similar solutions. This is a coordinated, continent-spanning tradition of astronomical observation and geometric planning. The Mound City group in the Scioto Valley of Ohio has been analyzed in terms of its relationship to solar alignments, and researchers have found evidence that specific mounds in the complex were positioned to mark the rising and setting of the sun on the solstices and equinoxes. The geometry of the connected earthwork complexes in the Paint Creek and Scioto valleys suggests a coherent planning vision that took the movements of the sun and moon into account across a landscape spanning many miles. The earthworks were not just local monuments. They were elements of a designed ceremonial landscape that used the natural topography and the movements of celestial bodies to create meaning at the scale of an entire valley system. This kind of astronomical landscape planning is not unique to the Ohio Valley. Cahokia has its own astronomical monument, a series of wooden posts that archaeologists have named Woodhenge by analogy with Stonehenge, that was used to mark the solstices and equinoxes by tracking the point on the horizon where the sun rose in relation to the posts. Multiple versions of Woodhenge were constructed at Cahokia over the centuries, each one aligned to the same astronomical events, suggesting that solar observation and the marking of the solar calendar were central to the ceremonial life of the city across its entire occupation. The medicine wheels of the northern plains show a similar preoccupation with astronomical alignments. The Bighorn medicine wheel in Wyoming, which dates to roughly 700 years ago, has spokes that align to the rising points of several bright stars at the summer solstice, as well as to the summer solstice sunrise itself. The Moose Mountain medicine wheel in Saskatchewan has alignments that correspond to the rising points of the same stars at approximately 2,000 years ago, when those stars would have risen at different positions on the horizon due to the precession of the equinoxes. If the Moose Mountain alignments are intentional, and researchers who have studied them believe they are, then the medicine wheel tradition in the northern plains encodes astronomical observations that date back at least 2,000 years, and that were maintained and updated as the positions of the stars changed. What does it mean to maintain an astronomical tradition for 2,000 years? It means sustained, multi-generational observation and record-keeping and intellectual transmission. It means that the knowledge of which stars to watch and when to watch them and what their positions mean was considered important enough to pass from generation to generation across a span of time that, for comparison, is roughly the same length of time that has passed since the beginning of the Common Era to the present. The astronomical traditions of the medicine wheel builders connect the northern plains to the broader mound-building world through a shared framework of celestial observation and landscape orientation that extended from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian Shield. We should talk about the deliberate erasure, not just the inadvertent erasure of time and weather and agricultural expansion, but the deliberate attempt to remove mounds from the landscape and from the cultural memory of the regions where they stood. The most graphic example is what happened to the mounds in the St. Louis area. When European American settlers began building the city of St. Louis in the early 19th century, they found themselves in the middle of an enormous earthwork landscape. The American Bottom, the floodplain on the Illinois side of the river, was the site of Cahokia and its satellite communities. But the Missouri side of the river, the bluffs and bottomlands where St. Louis grew, was also covered in mounds. Historical accounts from the early 19th century describe dozens of mounds in the area that would become the city's downtown. By the time anyone thought to systematically document what was there, most of them were gone. The most dramatic loss was a large, flat-topped platform mound in the river bottom area that the French settlers called Gros Montagne, and that later descriptions identify as a substantial structure, perhaps 60 or 70 feet high. It was leveled in the 1850s during the construction of railroad infrastructure. No archaeological investigation, no documentation beyond some cursory descriptions. Just the mound gone, removed because it was in the way, because its 1,700 years of accumulated meaning were less important than the efficiency of a railroad grade. This was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern repeated across the central Mississippi Valley as the region industrialized in the mid-19th century. Mounds were removed from town squares where they interfered with the grid of streets. Mounds were excavated not for knowledge but for the fill material they represented. Their carefully placed earth scooped out to level lots for construction. Mounds were plowed down by farmers who found them inconvenient obstacles in their fields. The loss was catastrophic, and it was compounded by the simultaneous destruction of the cultural contexts that would have helped interpret what survived. When the communities whose ancestors built the mounds were removed through the forced relocations of the Indian removal era, they took with them the detailed knowledge of site function and ceremonial use, and the specific meanings of the earthwork forms that no amount of subsequent archaeological excavation could fully recover. What we have left is extraordinary, but incomplete. The surviving earthworks, protected in state and national parks and on tribal lands and in the small patches of farmland, where farmers either could not or chose not to plough them down, give us enough to reconstruct the broad outlines of the mound building tradition. But the details, the specific ceremonies performed at each site, the exact social organization that built and maintained the earthworks, the particular stories and songs and prayers associated with the great monuments, much of that is gone, or it survives only in the oral traditions of the communities that have maintained it across centuries of disruption and suppression. Those traditions are not static. They are living. They are being shared. They are being connected to the archaeological record in ways that are producing new insights and correcting old errors. The collaboration between academic archaeologists and indigenous scholars and community historians is one of the most exciting developments in the field, and it is producing a picture of the mound-building world that is richer and more complex and more human than anything that pure material analysis could generate. The Chickasaw Nation has been deeply involved in reinterpreting the archaeology of the Natchez Trace region of Mississippi and Tennessee, bringing oral traditions to bear on sites that academic archaeology had been studying for decades without fully understanding. The Osage Nation has partnered with archaeologists to study the landscapes of the Osage homeland in terms that incorporate both material evidence and the oral historical tradition that the Osage have maintained about their connection to. Those landscapes, the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota, has been involved in research that connects the archaeological record of the Upper Mississippi region to Ojibwe oral traditions about the places and relationships that shaped their ancestors' lives. These collaborations are not just good ethics, they are good science. The oral traditions carry information about the past that cannot be recovered from material remains alone. They carry the names of places and the meanings of landforms and the astronomical knowledge embedded in ceremonial practices. They carry the memory of events that the archaeological record can only gesture toward. When an Osage elder speaks about the meaning of the division between Sky people and Earth people in Osage cosmology, that is primary evidence about the intellectual world of the Mississippian period, and it deserves the same careful attention that a radiocarbon date or a ceramic analysis receives. We should spend some time with the question of what the mound builders were actually trying to accomplish, because the emphasis on the mounds as monuments, as impressive physical achievements, tends to obscure the question of what they were for. Monuments are built for reasons. The pyramids of Egypt were royal tombs and expressions of pharaonic power and connections to the afterlife. The cathedrals of medieval Europe were houses of God and expressions of civic ambition and pilgrimage destinations. What were the mounds? The honest answer is that they were different things in different times and places and contexts. The burial mounds of the Adena and early Hopewell periods were, first and most obviously, graves. They covered the dead and marked their location and expressed the importance of specific individuals or lineages in the social order of their communities. But they were also more than graves. The way the burial goods were selected and arranged, the way the mound was often built in stages over multiple burials and multiple generations, the way the mound related to other mounds in a complex and to the broader landscape of ceremonial sites, all of this suggests that the mounds were places where the living maintained relationships with the dead, where the social order was legitimized by its connection to the ancestors, where the history of a community was made spatially visible in the landscape. The platform mounds of the Mississippian period served different purposes. They elevated important buildings above the level of the surrounding community, making them literally and symbolically higher. They put the chief's residence and the temple and the charnel house above the ordinary houses of ordinary people, expressing in 3 dimensions the hierarchical political structure that Mississippian societies developed. But they also connected the buildings they elevated to the sky, to the celestial realm that Mississippian cosmology associated with the world above. Being high was not just a political statement. It was a cosmological one. The chief who lived on top of Monk's Mound was closer to the sky world, to the sun and the morning star and the other celestial beings whose movements structured Mississippian time and meaning. The effigy mounds are perhaps the most mysterious category, the earthworks built in the forms of animals or birds or human figures, of which the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio is the most famous example. The Great Serpent Mound uncoils for almost a quarter of a mile across a ridge in Adams County, Ohio, its body undulating in a series of curves and its mouth open as if it is about to swallow an oval mound that sits at the end of its throat. The serpent appears to be aligned to the summer solstice sunset, its head oriented toward the point where the sun sets on the longest day of the year. The dating of the Serpent Mound is complicated and has been revised multiple times, but current evidence suggests it may have been built or significantly modified during the Fort Ancient period, roughly 1,000 years ago, by people related to the Adena and Hopewell traditions that had been building mounds in the region for over 1,000 years before that. What was the serpent for? The serpent is one of the most powerful and consistent symbols in the religious and ceremonial traditions of North American indigenous peoples, from the coastal nations of the Pacific Northwest to the desert peoples of the Southwest, from the Ojibwe of the Great Lakes to the Cherokee of the Appalachians. The underwater panther and the horned serpent are recurring figures in the cosmological systems of many Eastern North American peoples, representing the power of the world below, the watery underworld that in Mississippian cosmology is the mirror image of the world above. The Great Serpent Mound may be a representation of that cosmological power, a giant drawing on the landscape of a being whose significance extended across the entire eastern half of the continent. The fact that you can only really see its full form from above is significant. The people who built it could not have seen it from above. They had no aircraft. They had no elevated vantage point that would have revealed the full, sinuous form of the serpent. They built it anyway, because it was not meant to be seen by human eyes alone. It was meant to be seen by the beings that inhabit the sky world, by the powers that look down from above at the human landscape, by whatever consciousness the builders believed inhabited the heavens. The Great Serpent Mound is a message written for an audience that does not communicate in the same way humans do, and the act of writing it, of organizing thousands of hours of collective labor to inscribe a serpent across a hilltop in a form that could only be seen from the air, was itself a ceremony, an act of communication with the world above that we can no longer fully decode. The effigy mound tradition of the upper Midwest, concentrated in what is now Wisconsin and Iowa and the surrounding region, produced hundreds of earth and animal figures scattered across the landscape. Panthers and bears and birds and lizards and human figures, each one requiring the coordinated effort of a community to construct, each one placed in a specific relationship to the topography and to the other mounds in its group. Researchers have proposed that the effigy mounds encode a ceremonial map of the cosmos, with specific animal forms representing specific realms of the Mississippian and woodland period cosmological system, and with the placement of the mounds in relation to each other and to the landscape below them, expressing a spatial version of the relationships between those realms. This interpretation is not proven, but it is not speculative in the negative sense either. It is consistent with what we know about the cosmological traditions of the peoples whose ancestors built these mounds, and it explains why the mounds take the specific forms they do in the specific locations where they appear. We should return to Canada one more time before we come to the end, because there is a dimension of the Canadian connection to the mound-building world that we have not yet addressed, and it is one of the most fascinating and least-known aspects of the whole story. The wild rice, Manumin in Ojibwe, is the grain that grows in the shallow lakes and rivers of the upper Great Lakes and the boreal forest edge of the Canadian Shield, and it has been a staple food and a sacred plant for the Ojibwe and related peoples for as long as the oral traditions reach back. Wild rice was not cultivated in the European sense. It was managed, tended, harvested, and protected by the communities, whose territories included wild rice waters, and those communities developed sophisticated practices for managing wild rice beds that maintained their productivity across generations. But wild rice was also a trade commodity. processed wild rice is a storable, portable, calorie-dense food that can be transported over long distances and traded for other goods. And evidence from archaeological sites across the upper Great Lakes and the upper Mississippi Valley suggests that wild rice was indeed moving through trade networks in significant quantities. Communities further south, in the corn-growing heartland of the Mississippian world, had corn and squash and beans in abundance. Communities further north, in the wild rice country of the Shield, had wild rice and copper and furs. The two regions had complementary resources, and the trade networks that connected them were carrying food and materials in both directions. This means that the wild rice paddocks of northern Ontario and Manitoba were feeding the mound-building world. Not directly. Not in the sense that canoes of wild rice were being paddled to Cahokia and unloaded at the foot of Monk's Mound, but in the more diffuse sense that the trade networks linking north and south carried wild rice along with copper and furs and shell beads and information and ceremonial objects, and that the communities of the Canadian North were economic partners in the broader system that made the mound cities possible. This is the story that does not get told. The story of how the North and the South were connected. The story of how the communities of the Canadian Shield and the Boreal Forest were not isolated, primitive, simple societies living outside of history, but active participants in a continental economic and cultural system that produced some of the most sophisticated earthwork architecture in the ancient world. The story of how the copper, in a Hopewell burial mound in Ohio, passed through the hands of communities in Ontario and Michigan and Wisconsin before it reached the grave of the person it was buried with. The story of how the ideas that inspired the Newark Earthworks and Cahokia and the Great Serpent Mound were part of a broader intellectual and ceremonial tradition that was alive and active across the entire northern half of the continent. The mound builders did not live in a corner of North America. They lived at the center of it, and their descendants are still here, still carrying the traditions and the knowledge and the connection to the landscape that built those monuments, still insisting on the right to be recognized as the inheritors of one of the great civilizational achievements in human history. The question is whether the rest of us are finally ready to listen. There is something that happens when you stand at the base of Monk's Mound. It is not what you expect. You expect to be impressed, and you are. The scale is genuinely, viscerally impressive in a way that photographs do not capture. But what you do not expect is the feeling of presence, the sense that this place was made by people who knew exactly what they were doing and why, who brought a vision to their work that you can still feel in the way the earth was moved and shaped and placed. It is not the presence of a mystery. It is the presence of a clarity. Someone understood something about the world, about the relationship between human society and the cosmos, about the importance of marking the places where the sky meets the earth, about the necessity of making the invisible visible by moving enough dirt into the right shapes, and they built that understanding into the landscape in a way that has survived 1,000 years of neglect and destruction and willful misinterpretation. The mound builders were not a lost race. They were a found people who have been telling us who they are for as long as anyone has been willing to listen. The history is not hidden. It is waiting, in the earthworks that survive, in the oral traditions of the nations that carry it, in the archives of the archaeologists who have spent careers documenting it, in the testimony of the elders who know the names of the places and the meanings of the shapes and the purposes of the orientations that modern visitors walk past without understanding. The history is waiting for us to take it seriously. And taking it seriously means more than adding a paragraph to the curriculum. It means recognizing that the civilizational traditions of the mound builders are not past. They are continuous. They are alive in the communities whose territories include those earthworks, whose ancestors built them, whose ceremonial lives are still organized around the cosmological systems that designed them. It means supporting those communities in their efforts to protect and steward the sites that are still threatened by development and neglect. It means listening when Indigenous scholars and elders offer interpretations of those sites that go beyond what the material record alone can reveal. It means being honest about the history of suppression and misrepresentation that has kept this story from being told in the way it deserves. The lie in the textbook is not just about who built the mounds. It is about what those mounds mean. The lie is the suggestion that they are curiosities, impressive but peripheral, the remnants of a world that ended before the real history of North America began. The truth is that the mound building tradition is one of the foundational chapters of the real history of North America, a chapter that is still being lived by the communities that carry it forward, a chapter that has as much to teach us about human possibility and human achievement and human connection to the land as anything we learn about ancient Egypt or ancient Greece or the Roman Empire. And the full reckoning with that truth, the honest accounting of what was here and who made it and what was done to it and what survives and what needs to be protected and what needs to be returned and what needs to be listened to, that reckoning has not happened yet. It is still coming, and the Earthworks are waiting for it, patient as they have always been, outlasting every civilization that has refused to look at them honestly, holding the memory of what was built and why, carrying the knowledge forward in their shapes and their orientations and their relationships to the sky and the land and the water, waiting for a moment when the people who live around them finally become curious enough to ask the right questions and humble enough to accept the answers. As you are here, in the quiet at the end of this long journey through earth and time and the stories that were buried under the stories we were told, perhaps this is a moment for that kind of curiosity. The mounds are still out there. The traditions are still alive. The descendants of the builders are still speaking. The question is whether we will let what they have to say change the way we understand the world we live in and the land we live on and the history that made us who we are. If this story moved something in you, if it made the world feel older and more complicated and more interesting than you thought it was when you started listening, then maybe tap the like button and let the people who need to find this kind of thing be able to find it. If you want more nights like this, more long, slow journeys into the parts of history that do not make it into the textbooks, then maybe subscribe and come back. I try to make these as often as I can, because the world has more stories in it than most of us were ever told, and most of them are more interesting than what we were taught in school. Leave a comment if you feel like it. Tell me where you are and what time it is there. I read them. Someone in Peterborough, Ontario who lives 20 minutes from the Serpent Mounds. Someone in Collinsville, Illinois who can see the silhouette of Monk's Mound from their kitchen window. Someone in Manitoba who learned in this video that the Majorville medicine wheel is 5,000 years old and is trying to decide what to do with that information. Whatever you share, I'm glad you are here, and I'm glad you stayed through to the end. If you feel moved to support the channel more directly, there is a membership option here on YouTube, completely optional, that helps make it possible to keep doing this kind of long-form work. But you do not need to do anything. Listening is enough. The mounds have waited a long time for someone to tell their story properly. I am still learning how to do it. Sleep well. Let us go back further than Cahokia. Let us go back further than Hopewell. Let us go back to the beginning of the story that most people never hear. The very earliest evidence that people in North America were deliberately reshaping the landscape for purposes that went beyond immediate physical survival. Because if the story of the mound builders has a single most important fact, a single discovery that changes everything about how you understand who these people were and how long they had been doing what they did, it is this. The tradition of building intentional earthworks in North America is at least 5,400 years old. It began before writing. It began before the pyramids. It began before Stonehenge. It began before any of the great monument building traditions of the Old World that we were taught to regard as the origin points of human civilization. Watson Brake sits in the Wachita River floodplain of northeastern Louisiana, about 30 miles south of Monroe. It is not a famous site. It is not protected in a major national park. For most of the 20th century, it was not known to archaeology at all, because the landowner had not allowed excavation and because the mounds, which rise gently above the surrounding landscape, did not look particularly dramatic from the ground. In 1981, a survey by the Louisiana Division of Archaeology identified the site and recognized the mounds as likely artificial, but the dating work that would reveal the site's true significance was not completed until the late 1990s. When it was, The results stopped the field cold. 11 mounds, ranging in height from about 3 feet to about 25 feet, are connected by a low earthen ridge into an oval pattern roughly 900 feet in diameter. The whole complex was constructed approximately 5,400 years ago, give or take a few centuries, by people who were living a mixed hunting, fishing, and gathering economy with limited evidence of any plant cultivation. This predates the earliest agricultural societies in North America by well over 2,000 years. It predates the Poverty Point complex, which archaeologists had previously regarded as the oldest significant earthwork site in North America by nearly 2,000 years. It is so early that it forced a fundamental reassessment of the relationship between sedentism, surplus, agriculture, and monumental construction that had been a cornerstone assumption of American archaeology for generations. The assumption was simple. You need surplus food to feed a labor force that is not foraging. You need sedentism, settled communities, to accumulate surplus. You need agriculture to produce sedentism. Therefore, monumental architecture requires agriculture, and any evidence of monumental architecture should date to after the adoption of agriculture, or at least contemporaneously with it. Watson Brake says that assumption is wrong. The people who built Watson Brake were not farmers. They were harvesting fish and shellfish from the Wachita River and hunting and gathering across a productive wetland landscape that provided abundant resources without any cultivation, and they were organizing themselves to move earth in quantities sufficient to construct 11 mounds connected by a ridge, and they were doing this for reasons that we cannot fully reconstruct from the material evidence they left behind. This is the kind of discovery that should make headlines. It should change the chapter headings in textbooks about pre-Columbian North America, and to some degree it has, within the field of archaeology, but it has not made its way into general education, into the story that most North Americans learn about who was here before European contact. Most people who have heard of Poverty Point have not heard of Watson Brake. Most people who learned about the mound builders as a footnote in American history class have no idea that the tradition begins more than 5,000 years ago. The suppression here is less deliberate than at other points in this story. It is the suppression of inertia, of curricula that get updated slowly, if at all, of a general cultural assumption that the pre-Columbian history of North America is not important enough to teach in depth. The period between Watson Brake and Poverty Point, the long stretch from roughly 5,400 to 3,500 years ago, is one of the most understudied in North American archaeology. There are other mound sites from this period in Louisiana and Mississippi, and along the Gulf Coast, sites that are being identified and studied, but that have not yet received the kind of sustained attention that would allow us to say much about the continuity between Watson Brake and what came after. But the key point is that earthwork construction did not emerge suddenly at Poverty Point. Poverty Point was the culmination of a tradition that had been developing for nearly 2,000 years before it reached that scale and complexity. The foundation was deep, and then there is the question of what is underwater. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, sea levels worldwide were substantially lower than they are today. The Gulf Coast of North America at that time extended perhaps 100 miles further into what is now the Gulf of Mexico than it does today. The continental shelf that underlies the current Gulf was exposed land, and it was land that people were living on. As the ice melted and the seas rose, that land was slowly inundated, and everything that had been built and lived on and used and buried there went under the water. We have almost no knowledge of what was on that now submerged coastal plain. The archaeology of submerged landscapes is extraordinarily difficult and expensive, and the Gulf of Mexico floor has received very limited systematic archaeological attention compared to its potential. But what we know from the archaeology of the adjacent onshore regions suggests that some of the most productive and densely populated environments in pre-Columbian North America were the coastal wetlands and estuaries of the Gulf Coast, and those environments at their maximum extent before sea level rise were much larger than they are today. The early history of mound building in North America may be partly a story that is sitting on the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, inaccessible to us for the foreseeable future. This is not a speculation designed to add mystery to the narrative. It is a genuine constraint on our knowledge, a reason to be humble about claims to understand the full timeline and geographic extent of early earthwork construction in North America. We know what has been found on the current land surface and in the shallow near-shore environment. We do not know what has been inundated, and given that the coastal environments of the Gulf of Mexico were among the richest and most productive in North America, the probability that significant human activity occurred there before sea level rise is very high. The Hopewell period, which we have already talked about in terms of the Great Ohio Earthworks, deserves more attention as a continental phenomenon, because the Ohio sites, dramatic as they are, represent only one regional expression of a much broader tradition. Hopewell materials and Hopewell-style earthworks and Hopewell ceremonial practices appear across an enormous geographic range, from New York to Kansas and from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. This geographic spread is itself one of the most fascinating aspects of the tradition, because the spread happened not through military conquest or political empire, but through the voluntary participation of communities that chose to adopt the ceremonial and exchange practices of the Hopewell sphere, because they offered something valuable. What did Hopewell offer? At the most basic level, it offered access to a continental exchange network through which communities could obtain materials and objects that they could not produce locally. Obsidian from the Yellowstone region of Wyoming, grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountain West, Gulf Coast marine shells, Great Lakes copper, Appalachian mica, Florida alligator teeth. These exotic materials moved through the Hopewell exchange system to communities spread across the continent, and in return, those communities provided the labor and the local resources that kept the network functioning. The exotic materials ended up in the graves of people who had earned, through whatever combination of hereditary status and personal achievement, the right to be buried with them. The graves themselves, covered by mounds, became the permanent markers of the prestige system that the exchange network sustained. But Hopewell offered more than trade goods. It offered a shared ceremonial framework, a set of rituals and symbols and practices that created a sense of connection and identity across communities that might have had very little direct contact with each other. A community in Illinois and a community in New York might never have exchanged emissaries or goods directly, but they shared the same artistic style, the same burial practices, the same cosmological symbols, the same basic approach to marking the deaths of important individuals with earthen monuments. This shared framework created a kind of cultural common ground that facilitated the exchange network and that gave participants a way of recognizing each other as members of the same broad community, despite the distances and languages and local traditions that separated them. The decline of the Hopewell tradition around 500 CE is one of the puzzles that archaeologists have been working on for decades, without reaching a consensus explanation. The long-distance exchange networks that had sustained the tradition seem to have contracted significantly. The construction of large geometric earthworks ceased in the Ohio Valley. The elaborate burial ceremonialism that had placed hundreds of exotic objects in the graves of important individuals became simpler and less elaborate. The evidence for a continent-spanning network of ceremonial exchange becomes harder to see in the archaeological record after about 500 CE. The explanations proposed range from environmental change to political disruption to something like a deliberate rejection of the prestige system by communities that decided the costs of participation outweighed the benefits. None of these explanations is fully satisfying on its own. The most likely truth is that the decline of Hopewell involved a combination of factors operating differently in different regions over a period of several centuries, with some areas transitioning more rapidly than others, and with the local consequences varying depending on how central each region's participation in the network had been. But here is the crucial point. The decline of Hopewell is not the end of mound building, it is a transition. In some regions, particularly in the Ohio Valley and the surrounding areas, there is a period of several centuries in which large-scale earthwork construction is less visible in the archaeological record, a period sometimes called the Middle Woodland Gap. But in other regions, mound building continues and in some cases intensifies, and by roughly 800 to 900 CE, a new and in many ways more elaborate tradition of mound building is emerging in the central Mississippi Valley. The Mississippian tradition that we have already talked about in terms of Cahokia. The story did not stop. It transformed. The transformation from Hopewell to Mississippian is one of the most important changes in the pre-Columbian history of eastern North America, and it is still not fully understood. The key development is the adoption of intensive maize agriculture across the southeast and lower Midwest, which began to take hold in earnest after about 800 CE, and which transformed the demographic and political landscape of the region over the following centuries. Before intensive maize agriculture, the communities of the central Mississippi Valley were relatively small-scale, mobile or semi-mobile, and organized in ways that constrained population density and the accumulation of surplus. After intensive maize agriculture, communities could grow larger, could settle permanently in productive river bottomlands, could accumulate surplus grain that could be stored, redistributed, and used to feed specialized craft workers and ceremonial practitioners and political elites who did not grow their own food. Maize agriculture is what made Cahokia possible. The American Bottom, the floodplain where Cahokia was built, is one of the most productive agricultural landscapes in North America. Rich alluvial soil renewed by periodic flooding, long growing seasons, ample water, a community with the organizational capacity to manage intensive maize agriculture on the American Bottom could generate surplus on a scale that would support a very large non-agricultural population. And the Mississippian people who built Cahokia clearly had that organizational capacity, because they built a city that required feeding tens of thousands of people for centuries. Where did the maize come from? Maize was domesticated in Mexico approximately 9,000 years ago, and it spread northward over thousands of years through a complex process of diffusion and selective cultivation. By roughly 1,000 years ago, improved varieties of maize had been developed that could be grown successfully in the shorter growing seasons of the central Mississippi Valley, and once those varieties were available, the communities of the region adopted them with remarkable speed. Within a few generations, maize went from being a minor supplemental crop to being the agricultural foundation of the most complex societies in eastern North America. The northward spread of maize into what is now Canada is a separate story with its own fascinating complexity. In Ontario, maize appears in the archaeological record around 1000 CE, spreading from the south through trade networks and probably through the movement of people who brought seed and knowledge with them. The adoption of maize agriculture in Ontario transformed the communities of the North Shore of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario and the lower Great Lakes in ways that parallel what happened further south, allowing the development of larger, more sedentary communities and eventually the longhouse societies of the Haudenosaunee and Wendat confederacies that European explorers encountered in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Haudenosaunee longhouse communities are the northern expression of the same agricultural revolution that produced Cahokia, adapted to the shorter growing seasons and different environmental conditions of the Great Lakes region. This connection is rarely made explicit in Canadian education. The Haudenosaunee and Wendat confederacies are taught, when they are taught at all, as essentially separate phenomena from the mound-building cultures of the Mississippi Valley, but they are part of the same long story. They are the northern branch of the same agricultural revolution and the same tradition of complex social organization that produced the mound cities. The Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace, the constitutional framework of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that is one of the most sophisticated political documents of the pre-Columbian world, and that has been identified by historians as a possible influence on the framers of the American Constitution, grew out of a social and ceremonial tradition that is connected to the same intellectual currents that produced the Newark Earthworks and Cahokia. The connections are not always direct or linear. The mound-building tradition did not march in a single direction from one people to the next, depositing its ideas like sediment along the way. It was more complex than that, with ideas and practices moving in multiple directions simultaneously, being adopted and adapted and transformed by the communities they reached, sometimes moving back in the direction they came from in modified forms. But the underlying thread of connection is real, and it runs from Watson Break 5,000 years ago through Poverty Point and Adena and Hopewell and Mississippian and Fort Ancient and Princess Point, all the way to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the communities that met the Europeans, and it is a thread that is still alive today in the oral traditions and ceremonial practices and land relationships of the communities that carry this heritage forward. The question of what was deliberately suppressed and what was simply not known in the construction of the standard narrative of North American prehistory is one that requires some care, because the answer is not simple. Some of the suppression was deliberate and politically motivated. The lost race theory was propagated by people who had obvious political reasons to want the mounds to have a non-indigenous origin, and it was maintained in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary for much of the 19th century, because the people with the power to set the educational agenda had reasons to prefer it. That is deliberate suppression, but a significant amount of what is missing from the standard narrative is missing not because it was hidden, but because it was not looked for, or because it was found and then not shared with the broader public, or because the institutions and funding structures that support archaeological research have consistently prioritized certain regions and certain questions over others. The archaeology of Canada's pre-Columbian past has been significantly underfunded relative to the American Midwest and Southeast. The excavation and analysis of the Ontario mound sites has proceeded more slowly than it might have with more resources and more institutional attention. The connections between the northern trade networks and the southern mound cities have not been studied with the systematic focus they deserve, because the cross-border nature of the question falls between the jurisdictions of different national funding bodies and different professional communities. None of this is conspiracy, but all of it is choice, and the choices that have been made have produced a public understanding of North American prehistory that is significantly impoverished compared to what the archaeological record actually shows. The record shows a continent that was deeply and persistently connected, in which communities separated by thousands of miles maintained relationships of exchange and ceremonial affiliation over centuries, in which the natural resources of the North fed the ceremonial elaboration of the South, and the South sent back the symbols and practices and trade goods that shaped the cultural life of the North. The record shows a North America that was, in the most meaningful sense, a single cultural world long before any European arrived to impose a different kind of unity on it. The earthworks are the most visible evidence of that world. They are the permanent markers of the meeting places and the sacred sites and the ceremonial centers where the network converged and where the ideas and objects and people that kept it alive came together. They were built by people who understood their place in a very large world and who built monuments that expressed that understanding in the most durable way available to them, by moving earth. Sit with that for a moment. These people did not have metal tools. They did not have wheeled vehicles. They did not have writing. What they had was the knowledge of where to move the earth and how much and in what shapes. And they had the organizational capacity to mobilize hundreds or thousands of people to do the moving. And they had the astronomical knowledge to orient the monuments they built with a precision that modern engineers find impressive. And they had, most importantly, the vision to understand that marking the landscape in permanent ways, in ways that would outlast any individual human life, and that would serve as the expression of a community's relationship to the cosmos and to its ancestors and to the land, was worth the enormous effort it required. That vision was not primitive. It was sophisticated in a way that does not map neatly onto our usual frameworks for evaluating sophistication. It was not technologically sophisticated in the way we usually mean that phrase, but it was intellectually and organizationally and cosmologically sophisticated in ways that deserve to be recognized on their own terms, not as imperfect approximations of European models of civilization, but as fully realized expressions of a different, but no less complex, and no less admirable set of values and priorities. The mound builders valued connection over accumulation. They valued the relationship between the community and the landscape over the extraction of resources from the landscape. They valued the continuity of tradition across generations over the innovation that disrupts and replaces what came before. They valued the visible expression of cosmological understanding over the written record of historical events. These are not primitive values. These are different values, and understanding them on their own terms, rather than evaluating them against a standard drawn from a different tradition, is the beginning of actually understanding the world the mound builders built. The world they built is still here, in the mounds that survive, in the traditions of the nations that carry their heritage forward, in the astronomical alignments that still point to the sun and moon with the precision that was built into them 1,000 and 2,000 years ago. The lie in the textbook is not just about who built the mounds. It is about what those mounds represent and what the people who built them understood, and what we lose when we reduce their achievement to a curiosity or a mystery or a footnote. The truth is larger and stranger and more interesting than the lie. The truth is a story about human beings building a civilization across a continent over 5,000 years. A civilization that left marks on the landscape that are still visible today. A civilization whose ideas and values and relationships to the land and the sky are still alive in the communities that carry them forward. The truth is that the mound builders were never lost. They were here all along, and they are still here, and they have been waiting for the rest of us to catch up with what they have always known about this place. The path to understanding what was here before the story we were taught runs through the earthworks themselves, through the oral traditions of the communities that built them, through the work of the archaeologists and indigenous scholars who are slowly, painstakingly reconstructing the connections and meanings that the standard narrative has obscured. It runs through the willingness to sit with complexity, to resist the temptation of simple stories, to acknowledge that the history of this continent before European contact was not a blank space or a collection of simple societies waiting to be activated by the arrival of civilization from outside, but a rich and complicated and deeply human world that had been developing its own forms of complexity for thousands of years. And it runs through the kind of attention you have been paying tonight, the willingness to listen for a long time to a story that does not fit neatly into the categories you were given, to let the scale of what was here settle into your understanding in a way that changes the shape of what you think you know about the world you live in. The earthworks are waiting for that attention. They have been waiting for a long time, and they are patient in the way that things made of earth and time are patient, in the way that things built to outlast the people who built them are patient, in the way that things meant to speak to a future that could not be fully imagined are patient. They are still speaking. The question, as it has always been, is whether we are listening. There is one more thing to say before we come to rest, and it is about the future rather than the past. The surviving earthworks are under threat, not in the dramatic way that makes newspaper headlines, not from bulldozers or dynamite, though those threats have been real and continue to be real at specific sites, but from the slow, grinding pressure of a culture that does not value them enough to protect them consistently, from the erosion of neglect and the encroachment of development and the underfunding of the preservation and interpretation programs that would allow more people to understand what they are looking at when they see a mound on the landscape. The Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Cherokee, Osage, Ojibwe, Haudenosaunee, and many other nations whose territories include earthwork sites are fighting for those sites. They are fighting in the courts and in the legislatures, and in the academic journals, and in the public discourse for the right to have those sites recognized as what they are, the physical expression of their ancestors' understanding of the world, places that carry meaning and memory and relationship that cannot be fully measured or monetized or replaced. They are fighting for the application of laws like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act to the human remains and funerary objects still sitting in museum storage facilities across North America, remains and objects that were removed from the earthworks by archaeologists and collectors who did not have permission and did not regard permission as relevant. These fights are being won, slowly. The repatriation of human remains from the great mound sites has accelerated over the past generation. Some sites have been returned to tribal ownership, or co-management. Some of the most threatened earthworks have been protected by purchase or by federal designation. The designation of the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2023 is both a recognition of their global significance and a tool for their ongoing protection. Progress is being made, but the fight is far from over. The Octagon Mound at Newark is still a golf course. Hundreds of mound sites across the southeast and Midwest remain unprotected on private land. The archaeology of the Canadian mound building connections remains significantly underfunded. The story of what was here before the story we were taught is still not being told in most classrooms in a way that gives it the weight and depth it deserves. The earthworks are still waiting for the full recognition that they are owed. Not as monuments to a lost civilization, not as evidence of a mysterious past, not as tourist attractions or archaeological curiosities, but as the living heritage of living peoples whose relationship to those landscapes is as real and as valid as any other people's relationship to the places that made them who they are. The mound builders built for the future. They built things that would last. They built things that would speak across time. The question is whether we, who live in the future they were building toward, are finally ready to hear what those things are saying. Maybe we are. Maybe that is what it means to be here. At the end of this long journey through the earth and the sky and the stories that were buried under the stories we were told, maybe it means being willing to let the scale of it in, to let the 5,000 years of it in, to let the continent-wide connection of it in, to let the living continuity of it in. The mounds are still here, the traditions are still alive, the story is still being told, and you have been listening. If you made it here, to the end of this, and you feel something shifting in the way you understand the place you live and the history it carries, then the work this video was trying to do has done something real. If you want to go deeper, the reading list is real. Timothy Porketat's work on Cahokia, Roger Kennedy's Hidden Cities, Vine Deloria and the critiques of archaeology that the native intellectual tradition has been producing for decades, the published oral traditions of the Osage and the Muskogee, and the other nations whose histories are woven into the earthwork landscape. These are not easy readings in the sense of being simple or brief, but they are deeply rewarding in the sense of giving you something substantial to work with. And if you want to go to the places themselves, they are there. Cahokia Mound State Historic Site in Collinsville, Illinois, is one of the most undervisited major archaeological sites in the world. Newark Earthworks is scattered across a suburban Ohio landscape, but the surviving sections are accessible and staggering. Serpent Mounds Provincial Park in Ontario is a quiet, beautiful place that most Canadians have never heard of, and that will change the way you think about the history of that province. The Majorville Medicine Wheel in Alberta is harder to reach, but worth the effort. The mounds are there, they are waiting. Sleep well. The earth that built this continent is patient. Before we move forward into the deeper layers of this story, let us linger for a moment on something that tends to get passed over in most accounts of the mound-building world, and that is the sheer variety of the earthwork forms themselves. When most people think of ancient earthworks, they think of mounds, which is to say they think of raised piles of earth in roughly conical or pyramidal shapes. And yes, there are thousands of those, spread across eastern North America in every size, from a small raised garden bed to a structure the size of a city block. But the earthwork tradition of North America includes so much more than mounds in the conventional sense, and the variety of forms reveals a variety of intentions and functions that resist any single simple explanation. There are enclosures. These are earthwork walls, sometimes several feet high and tens of feet wide, arranged in geometric patterns that enclose large open areas. Circles, squares, octagons, combinations of these shapes connected by parallel walls. The great enclosures of the Hopewell period in the Ohio Valley are the most elaborate examples of this form, but enclosures appear across a wide geographic range and across a long time span, from the circular enclosures of the Middle Woodland period to the rectangular plaza enclosures of the Mississippian chiefdoms. What went on inside these enclosures? That is the question that drives much of the interpretive work in Hopewell archaeology. The geometric precision of the enclosures, the astronomical alignments that keep appearing when you analyze their orientations, the absence of significant domestic debris inside many of them. All of this points to specialized ceremonial use rather than ordinary habitation or agricultural activity. There are causeways, long, narrow, raised pathways connecting one earthwork feature to another, or connecting an earthwork complex to a nearby body of water or to another site in the landscape. The Hopewell causeways at sites like the Liberty Works and the High Bank Works run for significant distances across the landscape, connecting enclosures to each other and to the larger ceremonial geography of the Scioto Valley. These causeways were clearly not just roads in the utilitarian sense. They were processional ways, paths designed for the movement of people and objects in a ceremonially structured space, ways of moving through the landscape that express the relationship between different parts of the ceremonial complex. There are ridges and raised platforms that were used as the foundations for wooden structures, the residential and ceremonial buildings of the Mississippian period that sat on top of flat-topped mounds or within earthwork enclosures and that have disappeared entirely, leaving only their earthen foundations and the post holes that mark where the wooden walls once stood. The reconstruction of what those buildings looked like requires detective work, combining the post hole patterns with ethnographic accounts of similar structures from the contact period and with the architectural traditions visible in the material culture of the communities that built them. The result is a picture of substantial, well-constructed buildings, some of them quite large, that served as the visible expression of political and ceremonial authority within the Mississippian city. There are the effigy mounds, which we have mentioned, but which deserve more attention because they represent one of the most creatively distinctive expressions of the earthwork tradition. Concentrated in the upper Midwest, particularly in Wisconsin, the effigy mound tradition of roughly 900 to 1200 CE produced hundreds of earthen animal and bird and human forms scattered across the landscape, in groups that appear to express a systematic cosmological vision. The specific animals represented have parallels in the ceremonial traditions of the peoples whose ancestors built them. The bear representing the earth world, the bird representing the sky world, the water spirit or underwater panther representing the world below. The groups of effigy mounds at sites like Effigy Mounds National Monument in Iowa express these cosmological relationships in spatial form, with different animal types placed in positions that reflect the vertical and horizontal structure of the cosmos as it was understood in the ceremonial traditions of the region. The effigy mounds also demonstrate something about the mound building tradition that is easy to miss when you focus on the great enclosures and platform mounds. The tradition was not static. It was creative. It was not a fixed set of forms reproduced identically across centuries and regions, but a living tradition that innovated and adapted and expressed local values and local cosmological understanding within a shared, broader framework. Different communities took the basic impulse of earthwork construction, the impulse to mark the landscape in permanent ways that express the community's relationship to the cosmos and to the ancestors and to the land, and they expressed that impulse in forms that were specific to their own traditions and their own understanding of the world. This creative variety is one of the strongest arguments against the lost race theory and against any version of the story that sees the mound building tradition as the product of a single, external source. A tradition imported from outside, from a lost civilization or from old world contacts or from Mesoamerican influence, would not show this kind of organic, internally generated variety. It would look more uniform, more like a single template imposed on multiple locations. What we actually see is a tradition that developed from within, that grew from local roots in specific ecological and social contexts, and that spread and diversified as it moved across the continent through the networks of trade and exchange and ceremony that connected the communities of pre-Columbian North America. Now, let us talk about something that archaeology is only beginning to fully appreciate, and that is the way the mound builders understood and managed the natural landscape. For a long time, the standard approach to the earthworks was to treat them as structures imposed on the landscape, things that human labor put there that were separate from the natural world around them. But a more recent perspective, informed partly by indigenous knowledge and partly by more careful archaeological analysis, sees the relationship differently. The mound builders were not imposing on the landscape. They were reading the landscape and responding to it, working with the natural topography and ecology of the places they chose to build in ways that expressed a deep familiarity with those environments. The placement of earthwork sites is not random. The great Hopewell complexes of the Scioto and Paint Creek valleys are positioned in relation to the natural features of those valleys in ways that archaeologists have spent considerable effort documenting. The earthworks occupy specific positions on the river terraces, at the confluences of streams, on hilltops with specific views of the surrounding landscape. The geometry of the enclosures is oriented not just astronomically, but in relation to the natural drainage patterns and topographic features of the land. The sites are embedded in their landscapes, not plopped on top of them. The same is true of the Mississippian sites. Cahokia sits at the center of the American bottom, a floodplain that was itself a managed landscape. The communities that made up the Cahokia system were not just farming the bottomland, they were managing it, maintaining and modifying the drainage patterns and the agricultural infrastructure in ways that would have been invisible to a casual observer, but that were essential to the agricultural productivity that supported the city. The mounds of Cahokia are the most visible element of a managed landscape that extended for miles in every direction from the urban core. Understanding the mound builders as landscape managers, as well as monument builders, changes the scale of what we are talking about. We are not talking about a series of impressive construction projects. We are talking about a centuries-long transformation of specific landscapes through the combination of earthwork construction, agricultural management, controlled burning, and the deliberate modification of water features and drainage systems that turned the American bottom and the Ohio Valley and the coastal wetlands of the Gulf into something closer to designed environments than to wild landscapes. The mound builders were not passive inhabitants of a natural world. They were active shapers of the environments they lived in, and they shaped those environments in ways that reflected a deep, multi-generational knowledge of how those environments worked. This perspective also changes how we understand the collapse narrative. When archaeologists talk about the decline of Cahokia in the 13th and 14th centuries, they often frame it in terms of environmental degradation. The city depleted its local resources, deforested its surrounding landscape, overtaxed its agricultural system. There is some evidence for all of these things. But framing the decline purely in terms of environmental degradation misses something important. The people of Cahokia were not naive or incapable of managing their environment. They had been doing sophisticated landscape management for centuries. The deterioration of the Cahokian system was more likely the result of a complex interaction between environmental stress, political instability, and possibly a deliberate choice by communities that had been subordinate to the Cahokian polity to reject that subordination when it became possible to do so. The dispersal of population from the large nucleated centers like Cahokia in the 14th century was not necessarily experienced by the people involved as a collapse. Moving from a large, politically controlled urban environment to smaller, more autonomous communities organized around local resources and local political structures might well have been experienced as liberation rather than catastrophe. The oral traditions of some of the peoples whose ancestors participated in the Mississippian world do not tell a story of disaster and degradation. They tell a story of transformation and movement, of communities reorganizing themselves in response to changing conditions in ways that maintained the essential elements of their identity and their relationship to the land. The city emptied, but the people did not disappear, and the ideas they carried with them, the cosmological framework and the ceremonial practices, and the knowledge of how to read the landscape, and the organizational capacity for collective action, all of that continued. It continued in the smaller Mississippian chiefdoms that persisted in the southeast until European contact. It continued in the fort ancient communities of the Ohio Valley, who were still building ceremonial earthworks in the 15th century. It continued in the late pre-contact communities of the Great Lakes and the Northeast, who were developing the political frameworks that would eventually produce the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The tradition transformed. it did not end. Let us spend some time with a specific figure, not a historical individual whom we can name, but a type of person who appears in the archaeological record and in the oral traditions of the mound-building peoples, and who embodies something essential about how the mound-building world worked. This is the person who has sometimes been called a chunky player, a reference to the distinctive game that was central to the public ceremonial life of Mississippian communities. Chunky was played with a polished stone disc that was rolled across a prepared clay surface, and players would throw spears at the spot where they predicted the disc would stop. It sounds simple, but it was not. The preparation of the chunky disc itself was an act of extraordinary craft, requiring the grinding and polishing of a stone over many hours to achieve the precisely balanced, perfectly smooth form that allowed it to roll predictably. The preparation of the chunky yard, the flat clay surface where the game was played, was itself a significant community undertaking. And the game's strategic dimension, the prediction of where a rolling disc would stop based on subtle variations in the surface, and the initial velocity and angle of the roll, required a kind of refined physical intuition that could only be developed through years of practice. But Chunky was more than a game. It was a public performance of the skills and the values that the Mississippian world most highly esteemed. The chunky player who performed well in public, who could roll the stone with precision and throw the spear to the exact predicted stopping point time after time, was demonstrating a mastery of the body, a cultivation of focused attention, and a command of the physical world that were understood as expressions of spiritual power and social legitimacy. The great chiefs of the Mississippian world were, among other things, great chunky players, or at least they were expected to be, because the capacity to perform well at chunky was understood as evidence of the same qualities that made someone qualified to lead. The chunky stones themselves are beautiful objects, and the most elaborately crafted examples were clearly prestige items as well as functional game pieces. They appear in burial contexts at Mississippian sites, sometimes alongside other prestige objects like copper-covered wooden ear spools and engraved shell gorgets and fine pottery. A man buried with his chunky stone was being identified in death as he had been identified in life, as someone whose skill and power in the ceremonial arena of the chunky yard had defined his social identity. This is a small detail, but it opens onto something large. The mound-building world was a world organized around public performance. The ceremonies conducted in the great earthwork plazas, the games played on the chunky yards, the feasting and the exchange of gifts and the negotiations of political alliance that happened at the great seasonal gatherings, all of this was public in a way that modern political life rarely is. The legitimacy of the leaders of the Mississippian world was not based on hereditary right alone, or on military force alone, or on the control of economic resources alone, though all of these things mattered. It was based on performance, on the visible demonstration in public ceremonies and public games of the qualities that the community believed leadership required. This has interesting implications for how we understand the mounds themselves, which were, in a very real sense, stages for these public performances. The platform mound elevates the chief and the ceremonial building above the level of the ordinary community, making them visible from a distance, creating the vertical dimension that Mississippian cosmology associated with power and connection to the sky world. The Grand Plaza at the foot of the platform mound is the arena for the public ceremonies and games and political events that constitute the visible face of Mississippian political life. The whole spatial organization of the Mississippian city is designed to make the relationship between the leadership and the community legible in 3 dimensions, to express in the layout of the landscape itself the hierarchical and cosmological order that the society understood itself to embody. This is not a primitive political theatre. This is a sophisticated understanding of how public space shapes political life, of how the design of the environment influences the behavior and the consciousness of the people who inhabit it, of how the built environment can be made to express and reinforce the values and the relationships that a society wants to maintain. We build political buildings in our own time for the same reasons, organizing the spaces of legislative chambers and courthouses and public squares to express the political order we want to maintain, and the political relationships we want to make visible. The Mississippian builders were doing the same thing, with different materials and in the service of a different political and cosmological vision, but with no less sophistication in their understanding of how space and architecture and public performance work together to constitute a society's sense of itself. The question of what happened to the ritual knowledge, the ceremonial practices that gave the earthworks their meaning, is one that deserves careful attention. When the large ceremonial centers declined and the populations dispersed, when the European contact and the epidemic diseases of the 16th and 17th centuries devastated the communities of the Southeast and the Midwest, what happened to the knowledge of how to use those places and what they meant? Some of it was lost. Not all loss is recoverable, and the epidemics that swept through the eastern half of North America in the decades after European contact killed people in sufficient numbers to disrupt the transmission of ceremonial knowledge in ways that could not be fully repaired. Communities that lost 80 or 90% of their population in a generation lost elders who carried specialized ceremonial knowledge. They lost the practitioners whose training had been interrupted. They lost the community context within which that knowledge had been exercised and transmitted. The disruption was catastrophic in ways that are difficult to fully imagine, but some of it survived. The oral traditions of the Muskogee Creek people, gathered and published by scholars working with Creek communities in the 20th century, contain specific references to the construction and use of mounds that illuminate the ceremonial role of the earthworks in Muskogee life before and after European contact. The Muskogee word for town, talwa, is related to the word for the raised ceremonial mound at the center of the town square ground, and the central square ground, the open ceremonial space surrounded by covered seats and associated with the ceremonial fire that burns at the center of community life, is a continuation in ceremonial practice of the Mississippian Plaza and the spatial organization of the Mississippian Civic and Ceremonial Center. The Creek Square Ground is not an echo of the Mississippian Plaza. It is the Mississippian Plaza transformed and adapted over centuries of disruption and relocation and forced change, but maintaining the essential structure that organizes community ceremonial life around a central open space, where the visible performance of the community's relationship to the sacred and the political takes place. The fire at the center of the Creek Square Ground is the same fire that burned at the center of the Mississippian ceremonies, the same fire that was extinguished and rekindled in the annual renewal ceremonies that marked the new year in the Mississippian ceremonial calendar. The tradition did not end. It continued. The Choctaw Nation's relationship to the Nani-Hwaya Mound in Mississippi is another example of this continuity. Nani-Hwaya is a large platform mound in Winston County, Mississippi, and it is central to the Choctaw oral tradition of origins. The Choctaw account of their emergence as a people is geographically centered on Nani-Hwaya. The Choctaw people, in their own telling of their own history, came into being at Nani-Hwaya, and the mound is therefore not just an archaeological feature of their homeland, but the literal place of their origin as a people. The Choctaw relationship to Nani-Hwaya is not ancestral in the historical sense only. It is foundational in the cosmological sense, the way that a creation site is foundational, the place where the world as the Choctaw know it came into being. This is precisely the kind of relationship to the earthwork landscape that the lost race theory was designed to sever. If the mounds were built by a lost race with no connection to the current inhabitants of the land, then there is no reason to treat Nani-Hwaya as anything other than an interesting archaeological site. If the Choctaw oral tradition is accurate, if Nani-Hwaya is what the Choctaw say it is, then the mound is a living sacred place, not a relic of the past, but an ongoing site of identity and meaning for a specific community of people, and the question of who has the right to decide what happens to it is not an archaeological question. It is a political and spiritual question, and the answer the Choctaw would give is clear. The question of indigenous sacred sites and the protections they are or are not afforded under Canadian and American law is one of the ongoing flashpoints in the broader story of how the mound building heritage is or is not being honored. The legal frameworks in both countries provide some protection for archaeological sites and for the human remains and associated objects that they contain, but the protections are incomplete and inconsistently applied, and they often do not extend to the living ceremonial relationships that indigenous communities have with those sites. In Canada, the situation is complicated by the jurisdictional patchwork of provincial and federal laws that govern archaeological sites, and by the fact that the treaty frameworks that govern Crown Indigenous relationships vary significantly from one region to another. The earthworks sites of Ontario and Manitoba and Alberta are protected to varying degrees by provincial legislation, but the level of protection is not uniform, and the involvement of First Nations communities in decisions about research, management, and public interpretation of those sites has historically been limited. Progress is being made through the broader process of reconciliation and through specific legal developments like the Supreme Court decisions that have strengthened Indigenous land rights, but the work of aligning the management of earthwork sites with the values and interests of the communities whose heritage those sites represent is ongoing and unfinished. In the United States, the National Historic Preservation Act and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act provide important legal frameworks, but they too have gaps and limitations. The Octagon Mound at Newark being surrounded by a golf course is a reminder that legal protection does not automatically translate into the kind of recognition and respect that a site of this significance deserves. The ongoing negotiation between the local government, the golf course operators, the state of Ohio, and the Shawnee, Delaware, and other nations with connections to the Newark area is a microcosm of the larger set of negotiations that the full honoring of the mound building heritage requires. What would it look like to fully honor that heritage? It would look like curricula in Canadian and American schools that teach the pre-Columbian history of this continent with the same depth and seriousness that they teach the history of the civilizations of the Old World. It would look like museums that present the earthwork tradition and its associated material culture in a way that reflects the current state of archaeological understanding and that incorporates the knowledge and perspectives of the program descendant communities. It would look like management and interpretation programs at earthwork sites that are developed and led in partnership with those communities. It would look like the repatriation of human remains and associated objects to the nations that have claimed them. It would look like the legal protection of sacred sites extended to the living ceremonial relationships that communities maintain with those sites, not just to the physical features that can be measured and mapped by archaeologists. None of this is utopian. All of it is being worked toward in specific contexts by specific people and specific communities with varying degrees of success. The trend lines, for all of their frustrations and reversals, point toward a more honest and more complete engagement with the mound-building heritage than has existed at any point since the European invasion began disrupting and destroying it. The work of recovery and interpretation is also producing new knowledge at a pace that is genuinely exciting. If you are the kind of person who finds the deep past exciting, which, if you have listened this far, you probably are, LiDAR surveys, the use of airborne laser scanning to produce detailed topographic maps of the landscape that can see through forest cover to reveal buried or obscured earthwork features, have been transforming the field over the past decade. In the Ohio Valley and the Midwest, LiDAR has revealed the existence of earthwork features that were not visible from the ground and that were not captured in historical surveys, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct the extent of earthwork complexes that were previously known only in fragmentary form. In the Maya region of Mexico and Central America, LiDAR has completely revolutionized our understanding of the scale and complexity of pre-Columbian urban settlement, revealing that the Maya lowlands were far more densely populated and more intensively managed than anyone had previously suspected. Similar revelations are possible, and to some extent are already happening, in the earthwork landscapes of eastern North America. The full extent of the Cahokia urban system, the full reach of the Hopewell ceremonial landscape in the Ohio Valley, the full network of mound sites connected to the great ceremonial centers of the Mississippian world. All of this is being mapped and understood with a precision that was not possible 20 years ago. Ancient DNA research is another frontier that is rapidly changing our understanding of the mound-building peoples. The genomes of individuals buried in the earthworks of the Hopewell period and the Mississippian period are being sequenced and analyzed, revealing patterns of population, movement, and genetic relatedness that complement, and in some cases complicate the picture derived from the material culture. The results so far suggest that the Hopewell Exchange network involved not just the movement of goods but the movement of people, that individuals were traveling long distances to participate in the ceremonial life of the great Hopewell centers, and that the genetic diversity found at Hopewell burial sites reflects this continental-scale mobility. Ancient DNA from Cahokia is particularly revealing. The human remains from Mound 72, a mortuary mound at Cahokia that was excavated in the 1960s, and that contained the remains of several hundred individuals, including several elaborately furnished burials, have been the subject of ongoing genetic analysis that is producing a complex picture of the social organization of the Cahokian community. The evidence suggests that the individuals buried in the most elaborate of the Mound's 72 burials, the so-called beaded burial, that included a man laid out on a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads arranged in the form of a bird, were not closely related to each other and were not from the same local community. They may have been from different communities brought together at Cahokia for ceremonial purposes, or they may represent a different kind of social selection than simple kinship. This kind of analysis is still in its early stages, and its interpretation requires careful collaboration with the descendant communities who have knowledge of the ceremonial practices and social structures that the material and genetic evidence can only partially illuminate. But the potential of ancient DNA research to reveal dimensions of the mound-building world that are invisible to conventional archaeology is genuinely exciting, and it promises to significantly expand our understanding of who the mound builders were, where they came from, how they were organized, and how the communities of the earthwork landscape related to each other across the centuries. The story of the mound builders is not finished. It is being written right now, in the excavation reports and the genetic analyses and the oral history projects and the repatriation negotiations and the curriculum revision efforts and the conservation programs that are, slowly and imperfectly, giving this tradition the recognition it deserves. Every new LiDAR survey, every ancient DNA analysis, every collaborative project between archaeologists and indigenous scholars, every curriculum that includes more than a paragraph about pre-Columbian North America, every legal decision that strengthens the protection of earthwork sites or the rights of descendant communities adds something to the story. And the story is, in the deepest sense, a story about this place, not about a far-off civilization that happened to build impressive things. About this land, the land that you are lying on or sitting on or walking on right now, whether you are in southern Illinois or southwestern Ontario, or the Saskatchewan Plains or the Tennessee River Valley, the mound builders lived here. They changed this land. They left marks on it that are still visible, and the communities that carry their heritage are still here, still in relationship with this land, still working to have that relationship recognized and honored. That is the story we were not taught. That is the story the textbooks got wrong, or minimized, or ignored entirely. And it is a story that matters, not as an abstract historical correction, but as a living truth about the place we share, about who was here before us, and what they understood about this land, and what they built here, and what they passed forward to the people who came after them. The mounds are monuments to that understanding. They are built knowledge of the cosmos and the landscape and the community and the ancestors, pressed into the earth in forms that have endured for hundreds and thousands of years. They are the most durable thing the mound builders left behind, and they are still saying something. Whether we are wise enough, humble enough, curious enough to understand what they are saying is the question that the mounds are always asking of every generation that walks past them. Perhaps this generation is finally starting to listen. Perhaps you are. And if you are, then the story, the real story, the one the earthworks have been trying to tell for 1,000 years, is already reaching you, already settling into the place in your understanding where it has always been waiting to go, already changing the shape of what you know about the world you live in, and the land you live on, and the people who were here before you and the people who are still here. Sleep well. The mounds are standing. There is a detail about Cahokia that does not appear in most accounts, and it is one that changes the character of the place completely when you learn it. In the early 11th century, at roughly the same moment that Cahokia was reaching its maximum population and political complexity, the city underwent what archaeologists have interpreted as a large-scale reorganization. The existing communities in the American bottom were not simply expanded. They were, in at least some cases, deliberately removed, and the landscape was redesigned. Evidence suggests that in some areas adjacent to the central Cahokia precinct, existing villages were cleared to create the Grand Plaza and the organized residential neighborhoods that characterize the mature Cahokian urban plan. This was not gradual organic growth. This was planned urban development, the imposition of a designed spatial order on a landscape that had previously been organized according to different principles. What does that tell us about the Cahokian political order? It tells us that whoever was doing the planning had the authority to relocate communities, to clear existing settlements, to impose a new spatial logic on an inhabited landscape. That is a very significant kind of power. It is the power of a state, or at least of something very much like a state. And the fact that it was exercised in the early 11th century suggests that the Cahokian political entity underwent a significant transition at that moment, a consolidation of authority that allowed for the kind of top-down landscape planning that the archaeological evidence reveals. Who exercised that authority? The Cahokian Great Sun, as later Natchez documents describe the paramount chief, was a figure whose political legitimacy was wrapped in a divine or semi-divine identity. The paramount chief of a Mississippian polity was not simply a successful warrior or a skilled diplomat, though successful warriors and skilled diplomats tended to have advantages in the competition for leadership. The Mississippian paramount was the embodiment of the connection between the human community and the powers of the cosmos. He or she, and there is evidence for female rulers in the Mississippian world, stood at the intersection of the human and the divine, mediating the relationship between the community and the forces that controlled fertility, weather, the movements of celestial bodies, the success of the harvest, and the outcome of warfare. The paramount's residence on top of the platform mound was not just a symbol of political hierarchy. It was a cosmic statement, a claim that the person at the top of the mound was the point where the sky world and the human world made contact. This is a political theology as sophisticated as anything produced by the great civilizations of the Old World. The divine right of kings in medieval Europe, the mandate of heaven in imperial China, the divine nature of the Egyptian pharaoh, all of these are expressions of the same basic insight, that political authority is more stable and more effective when it is understood as connecting the community to something larger than itself, something cosmic or divine that gives the political order a significance beyond mere human arrangement. The Mississippian version of this insight was not borrowed from the Old World. It was developed independently in the context of the specific ecological, social, and cosmological conditions of the central Mississippi Valley, and it was expressed in the specific forms of the Mississippian civic and ceremonial landscape. The knowledge systems that supported this political theology were maintained by specialists, people whose role in the community was precisely to preserve and transmit the astronomical observations, the ceremonial protocols, the historical narratives, and the cosmological frameworks that gave the system its coherence and its authority. In some ways, these specialists were like the scribal and priestly classes of the literate civilizations of the Old World, keepers of the esoteric knowledge that ordinary community members had neither the time nor the training to master. But because the mound-building world did not use writing, this specialist knowledge was entirely oral and practical, maintained through training and apprenticeship and the regular performance of the ceremonies that embodied the knowledge, rather than through the textual preservation that gave old-world priestly knowledge its particular character. The absence of writing is one of the features of the mound-building world that most often leads to its dismissal or underestimation by people trained in the European humanist tradition. Writing, in that tradition, is almost synonymous with civilization. The ability to record information in permanent form, to accumulate knowledge across generations without depending on the fallibility of human memory, to communicate over distances and across time, these are capacities that writing makes possible, and that the absence of writing supposedly forecloses. Without writing, in this view, there can be no real history, no genuine intellectual tradition, no accumulation of knowledge sophisticated enough to count as science or philosophy or law. This view is wrong, and it is wrong in ways that become obvious when you look at what oral traditions can actually preserve and transmit. The astronomical alignments of the Newark earthworks demonstrate that the Hopewell people maintained accurate observations of the lunar standstill cycle over a period of at least 18.6 years, the length of the cycle, and almost certainly over many cycles, because building an earthwork complex that encodes the cycle with the precision documented at Newark required knowing not just one occurrence of the lunar extremes, but the full periodicity of the cycle, and the ability to predict where it would occur. That knowledge was preserved orally and through the practice of sustained observation, and it was accurate enough to be built into monuments that are still aligned to the lunar extremes 2,000 years later. The oral traditions of the mound-building peoples also preserved historical information of a kind that is only now being recognized as potentially accurate over very long time spans. The Aboriginal oral traditions of Australia include accounts of landscape events, volcanic eruptions, flooding of coastal areas, changes in sea level, that have been dated by geologists and found to correspond to real events that occurred 7,000 years ago or more. The mechanisms by which oral traditions preserve specific factual information over this kind of time span are still being studied, but they clearly exist, and they involve the embedding of important information in narrative forms, ceremonial contexts, and mnemonic structures that allow accurate transmission across many generations. The oral traditions of the mound-building peoples have not been systematically studied from this perspective, in part because the institutional relationship between the communities that hold those traditions and the academic community that might study them has historically been one of extraction rather than partnership. But the preliminary evidence suggests that those traditions do preserve specific and accurate information about landscape features, historical events, and ecological relationships that extends well beyond what might be expected of purely oral transmission, and that the ceremonial contexts in which the traditions are maintained contribute significantly to their stability and accuracy. The medicine wheels of the northern plains, which we have mentioned in connection with astronomical alignments, are also associated with oral traditions that preserve knowledge about their use and meaning in ways that complement what archaeological analysis reveals. The Blackfoot oral tradition about the Majorville medicine wheel, for example, describes the site as a place of ceremony and spiritual practice that has been maintained continuously for as long as anyone can remember, and the archaeological evidence is consistent with a period of use extending back at least 4,000 to 5,000 years. The oral tradition and the archaeological evidence are not in conflict. They are telling the same story in different registers, and listening to both together gives a richer picture than either provides alone. The Ojibwe oral tradition about the sleeping giant, the great rock formation at the head of Lake Superior near present-day Thunder Bay, Ontario, is another example of the way oral tradition preserves knowledge about the landscape and the events that shaped it. The sleeping giant, in the Ojibwe telling, is Nanabozho, the culture hero and trickster of the Ojibwe tradition, who was turned to stone in a particular moment in the story of how the world came to be as it is. The geological feature that the story interprets is real, a dramatic mesa formation visible from far across the lake. The story connects the community to the landscape in a way that is both aesthetic and explanatory, both beautiful as narrative and functional as a mnemonic that preserves knowledge of the feature's location and significance. Whether there is historical memory embedded in the sleeping giant story about specific events in the geological or human history of the Lake Superior Basin is a question that has not been fully investigated. But the broader pattern, of oral traditions that preserve accurate information about landscape and astronomical features across very long time spans is well established enough to suggest that dismissing these traditions as myth or folklore misses something important about what they are and what they do. The story of the mound builders is, in part, a story about different kinds of knowledge and different ways of preserving it. The earthworks are one kind of knowledge storage. They preserve astronomical alignments, spatial relationships, and cosmological information in a form that endures as long as the Earth itself endures. The oral traditions are another kind. They preserve narrative, relational, and explanatory information in a form that depends on human transmission but that can, under the right conditions, be extraordinarily stable over very long periods. The material objects found in the mounds, the copper and mica and shell and ceramics, are a third kind. They preserve information about craft traditions, trade networks, and aesthetic values in a form that survives because of the durability of the materials themselves. None of these forms of knowledge storage is inferior to writing as such. They are different, with different strengths and different vulnerabilities. Writing can preserve information against the disruption of oral transmission, can accumulate across many more minds than any oral tradition can reach, can be copied and distributed in ways that make it far more resilient against the loss of any single repository. But writing depends on the survival of the writing system and the community of readers who understand it, and civilizations whose writing systems are lost face the same kind of interpretive gap that the mound-building world faces from the outside. We can read the hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt and the cuneiform of ancient Mesopotamia only because enormous effort was invested in deciphering them. If we had not been able to decipher them, what we know about those civilizations would not be fundamentally different from what we know about the mound builders from the archaeological record alone. The fundamental difference is that the mound builders' descendants are still here and still speaking, and the Egyptians and Mesopotamians who could have told us the full meaning of their own monuments are not. This is the paradox at the heart of the mound-building story. We have access to something that no other ancient civilization's archaeological record gives us. The living intellectual heirs of the tradition, the communities whose ceremonial life and oral traditions and land relationships are the continuation of the same tradition that built the mounds. We have, in principle, the ability to understand the mound-building world not just from the outside through material analysis, but from the inside through the living knowledge that the descendant communities carry. The question is whether the academic community and the broader public are willing to engage with that living knowledge on its own terms, rather than treating it as an interesting supplement to the real work of archaeological analysis. The answer, increasingly, is yes. The collaborative archaeology that is happening at sites like Cahokia and Newark and Poverty Point, where indigenous communities are involved not just as consultants but as intellectual partners in the research, is producing a different kind of knowledge than purely academic archaeology could generate alone. The questions being asked are different. The interpretations being offered are richer. The sense of who the mound builders were as human beings, with specific values and specific relationships and specific understandings of the world, is more fully human than the purely analytical picture that material culture analysis provides. This is not a matter of preferring one kind of evidence over another. Both the material evidence and the oral and ceremonial traditions are evidence, and both require the same careful, critical evaluation that any evidence deserves. The point is that using both together, in genuine partnership between academic researchers and indigenous communities, produces better knowledge than using either one alone. And better knowledge is what the mound-building world deserves. After centuries of being misrepresented, minimized, and mythologized in ways that served everyone's interests except the truth. The truth is that the mound builders were building for the future. The astronomical alignments of the great earthwork complexes are not just records of past observations. They are structures designed to allow future observation, future alignment, future ceremony, future connection between the community and the cosmos. The builders of the Newark earthworks were not just marking where the moon rose on a specific night in the 1st century CE. They were creating a structure that would allow the moon to rise in alignment with their earthwork on every recurrence of the lunar standstill cycle, indefinitely into the future. They were building for their grandchildren and their grandchildren's grandchildren, and every generation that would come after, and stand in the octagon and watch the moon rise over the carefully placed earthen walls, and understand that what they were witnessing was the same thing that their ancestors had witnessed, and that their descendants would witness after them. This is a form of temporal ambition that is not unique to the mound builders. The builders of the great cathedrals of Europe did the same thing, creating structures whose construction spanned generations and whose use was intended to span centuries. The builders of Stonehenge did the same thing, creating an astronomical monument designed to mark the solstices indefinitely. But the mound builders did it across a much larger geographic area, with a much larger set of interconnected sites, and with a degree of astronomical precision that is still impressing engineers and astronomers who study those alignments today. The earthworks of the Hopewell period are, in a very real sense, a message to the future, not in the sense of containing information encoded in a form that needs to be deciphered, though they contain information of that kind too, but in the sense that they are an assertion of continuity, a claim that the relationship between this community and this landscape and this sky will persist, that future generations will stand in these earthworks and look at the same moon that the builders watched and understand themselves as part of the same ongoing story. That message has been received, imperfectly and belatedly, by the communities that carry the tradition forward. The Shawnee, who have connections to the Ohio Valley earthwork landscape, the Delaware, the Miami, the other nations whose ancestors participated in the Hopewell and late Woodland periods in the Ohio region, all of them maintain some relationship to the earthwork sites of their homeland, and all of them have been working, with varying degrees of success, to have that relationship recognized in the management and interpretation of those sites. The message has also been received, in a different way, by the people who study the earthworks from the outside and find themselves changed by what they discover. The archaeologists who have spent careers working at Cahokia or at the Newark earthworks tend to describe their relationship to those sites in terms that go beyond professional detachment. There is something about working in the presence of the earthworks that changes how you think about the human capacity for vision, for sustained collective effort, for the building of things that outlast any individual life or any individual generation. Something about standing in a Hopewell enclosure and looking at the precise geometry of the earthen walls and knowing that what you are looking at was built 2,000 years ago by people working with wooden tools and carrying earth in baskets, people who understood the lunar cycle well enough to encode it in the landscape at this scale. Something about that experience changes your default assumptions about what human beings are capable of. And perhaps that is the most important thing the mound builders are still saying. Not a specific historical fact that needs to be inserted into the textbooks, though there are many of those, but a more fundamental message about the range of human possibility, about the things that people can do when they are organized around a shared vision and a shared understanding of what matters, and a commitment to building things that will outlast them. The mound builders did not know about electricity or the internet or the internal combustion engine, but they understood something about the relationship between human beings and the cosmos and the land that our civilization has largely lost, or has buried under so many layers of technology and abstraction that it has become very hard to find. And the earthworks, patient as they are still pointing toward it, still encoding it in the angles of their walls and the alignments of their axes and the forms of the animals and birds and serpents that their builders pressed into the earth, still waiting for us to be ready to understand what they are saying. There is a moment, if you go to the right places and look at the right things, when all the history and the archaeology and the politics and the suppression and the recovery fall away, and you are left with just this, a human being looking at something that other human beings made a very long time ago, and feeling across that enormous distance of time the presence of the people who made it, the clarity of their vision, the power of what they understood. The earthworks give you that moment in a way that few things in the world can. They are built from the same earth you are standing on, shaped by hands not entirely unlike yours, oriented to the same sun and moon that you see when you look up, and they are saying something. Something that every generation that has walked past them since they were built has had the opportunity to hear. Something that is still audible, if you are willing to be quiet enough and still enough and humble enough to listen. The mound builders built cities that have been swallowed by time. They built trade networks that connected a continent. They built astronomical observatories that encoded knowledge in the landscape. They built a world, a full human world, with its politics and its commerce and its art and its religion and its philosophy and its understanding of the cosmos. And then European contact and the epidemics and the wars and the land seizures and the forced relocations and the lost race theory and the curriculum that starts history in 1492 buried all of that under a story that was smaller and simpler and more convenient for the people who needed to believe that what they were taking had never been much to begin with. The burying is not complete. The earthworks are still there. The traditions are still alive. The descendants of the builders are still speaking. And the truth, patient as the mounds themselves, is still waiting to be told in full. You have heard part of it tonight. The rest of it is in the places themselves, in the earthworks that survive, in the oral traditions and the ceremonial knowledge and the land relationships of the communities that carry this heritage forward, in the ongoing research of the archaeologists and indigenous scholars who are slowly putting together the picture that the suppression tried to prevent. The rest of it is waiting for you, if you want to find it. If this journey has moved something in you, if it has changed the way you understand the continent you live on, and the history it carries, and the people who have been here since long before the story most of us were taught, then perhaps you will carry something forward from it. Not just the facts, though the facts matter, but the quality of attention that the earthworks ask of you, the willingness to look at something old and strange and patiently persistent and ask what it is saying, rather than assuming you already know. The humility to recognize that the world is older and more complicated and more interesting than the story you were given, and that the people who were here before you understood things about this place that it would be worth taking the time to learn. The mounds are still standing, the traditions are still alive, the story is still being told, and you have been listening. If you made it to the end of this, then you know something tonight that you did not know when you started, and you know it the way you know things when you have sat with them for a long time, rather than consuming them quickly. That is the only way to really know something this old and this deep, slowly, in the dark, with patience. If you want to keep exploring this kind of history, the kind that does not make it into textbooks but that is more real and more interesting than what does, then subscribe and come back, because there is always more of this waiting to be found and brought into the light where it belongs. Leave a comment and tell me where you are tonight and what this brought up for you, because I read them, and because the people in the comments on these videos are always surprising and moving and wonderful, scattered across the world and across time zones, all drawn to the same long, quiet questions about who we are and where we came from and what was here before us. Thank you for staying. The earth that built the mounds is the same earth you are resting on tonight, and it remembers everything. Let us slow down and go deeper into something that the fast-moving surface of this story has not had time to fully inhabit, and that is the specific experience of the landscape in the places where the mound-building tradition was most intensely expressed. Because the earthworks are not just data points in an archaeological argument, they are places, and places have a character that the data points cannot capture, and the character of the earthwork places tells you something about the people who made them that the measurements and the alignments and the ceramic typologies cannot. The Ohio Valley in the Hopewell period was, by any reckoning, one of the most densely ceremonially developed landscapes in the ancient world. The Scioto and Paint Creek valleys, the Muskingum drainage, the Miami Valley, all of them were studded with earthwork complexes of varying scales and functions, connected by trade routes and ceremonial relationships, and the movement of people who traveled to the great centers from communities spread across the continent. What did it feel like to approach one of the great Hopewell enclosures from the outside? To walk up the approach causeway toward the entrance of a circle or an octagon that enclosed acres of carefully prepared space? You would have been aware of the scale before you entered. The earthen walls of the great Hopewell enclosures rose high enough to be visible from a distance, to announce their presence across the valley floor. As you approached along the causeway, the walls would have grown until they were above your head, cutting off the surrounding landscape and channeling your attention toward the opening ahead. The transition from the outside world to the enclosed space was designed. It was a ceremonial transition, a movement from the ordinary world of human activity to the enclosed and dedicated space of ceremony and contemplation and cosmic alignment. The architecture of the approach was doing something to your consciousness before you ever set foot inside the enclosure. Inside, the scale of the space would have been stunning. The Great Circle at Newark encloses more than 26 acres. Standing at the center, you would have seen nothing but the earthen walls rising around you and the sky above, a sky framed by the precise geometry of the enclosure in a way that focused your attention on the celestial space directly overhead. In that space, at the right time of year, the moon would rise over the earthen walls in precise alignment with the geometry of the enclosure, appearing at a point on the wall that had been positioned exactly to receive it. The experience of watching that alignment from inside the enclosure, knowing that the position of the moon's rising corresponded exactly to the geometry of the walls surrounding you, would have been powerful in ways that go beyond what we usually think of as religious experience. It would have been verifiable. It would have been predicted. The ceremonial calendar would have told you that this night was the night when the moon would rise in alignment, and you would have gathered inside the enclosure to witness it, and the moon would have risen exactly where it was supposed to rise. The predictive power of the astronomical knowledge embedded in the earthwork would have been visible to everyone present, and that predictive power would have confirmed the authority and the knowledge of the people who had built it and maintained it and organized the ceremony around it. This is one of the functions of astronomical monuments across cultures. They provide verifiable demonstrations of knowledge that otherwise has to be taken on faith. When the sunrise aligns with the Stonehenge trilithons on the summer solstice, everyone present can see that the alignment is real, that the builders knew what they were doing, that the knowledge they possessed was real knowledge. The same demonstration happens at the Newark Earthworks on the nights of the lunar standstill, and it would have happened on those nights for as long as the earthworks remained intact, which is to say for 2,000 years and still counting. The earthwork is a repeating demonstration of the validity of the astronomical tradition that it encodes. This function, the demonstration of knowledge through the accurate prediction of celestial events, is something that the mound builders understood and deliberately exploited in the design of their earthworks. And the knowledge itself was not static. The astronomer priests or ceremonial specialists who maintained the tradition were not just repeating observations made by their ancestors. They were adding to them, refining them, identifying new celestial events that could be tracked and marked and incorporated into the ceremonial calendar. The tradition was a living intellectual enterprise, not a set of fixed practices handed down unchanged. The ceramics of the mound-building world tell a similar story. Pottery is one of the things archaeologists study most carefully because it is both widespread and highly diagnostic, meaning that the style and technology of ceramics at a given site tell you a great deal about the cultural tradition and the date of the occupation. The pottery of the Hopewell period is technically accomplished and stylistically distinctive, with characteristic decorative motifs that appear across the enormous geographic range of the Hopewell cultural sphere. But the pottery of the Mississippian period is something else. It represents a genuine technological leap, the production of high-fired, relatively thin-walled vessels with a range of specialized forms that suggest a degree of craft specialization and a level of ceramic technology that approaches that of contemporary Old World traditions. The Cahokian ceramic tradition includes vessels that are beautiful as well as functional, that were clearly produced with attention to aesthetic effect as well as practical utility. The negative painted ceramics of the Mississippian period, in which a design is applied to the pot in a substance that resists the paint and is then removed to leave the design in the original clay color against a painted background, are technically demanding and visually sophisticated. The effigy vessels that represent human faces and figures or animal forms are fully sculptural achievements. Three-dimensional representations executed in fired clay with a mastery of the medium that reflects long practice and refined skill. These objects were made for specific purposes within the ceremonial and social life of the Mississippian world. The finest vessels appear in burial contexts, accompanying the dead on whatever journey they were understood to be undertaking, or in the structured deposits that mark the end of a specific ceremonial phase at a major site. The iconography on the ceramics connects them to the broader visual language of the Mississippian ideological interaction sphere, the shared system of images and symbols that expressed the cosmological framework of the Mississippian world across its entire geographic range. Understanding the iconography requires knowing the cosmology, and knowing the cosmology requires listening to the oral traditions of the descendant communities, and listening to those traditions requires a kind of intellectual humility that the academic study of the mound-building world has not always demonstrated, but is slowly learning to practice. The Birdman motif that appears so frequently on Mississippian ceramics and shell gorgets is not just a decorative bird-human hybrid. It represents specific relationships in the Mississippian cosmological system, relationships between the human world and the sky world, between the living and the ancestors, between the political authority of the chief and the cosmic power of the beings who inhabit the celestial realm. When you know what the Birdman represents, you see it differently, and you cannot fully know what it represents without listening to the people who carry the tradition that created it. This is the fundamental message of the collaborative archaeology that is transforming the field, not that indigenous knowledge replaces archaeological analysis, but that they are complementary, that each one illuminates what the other cannot see alone, and that the combination of the two produces a richer, more fully human understanding of the mound-building world than either provides alone. Let us also talk about the food, because the food tells you things about a culture that the ceremonial objects and the astronomical alignments do not. The diet of the Hopewell people, reconstructed from the stable isotope analysis of human bones and from the plant and animal remains found at Hopewell sites, was remarkably diverse. They were eating white-tailed deer and turkey and other forest game. They were eating freshwater fish and shellfish from the rivers and streams. They were eating a wide variety of wild plant foods, including nuts and berries and seeds and roots. And they were eating some cultivated plants, including a group of native North American domesticates, sunflower and sumpweed and goosefoot and other species, that were being deliberately grown in small garden plots near the settlements. This combination of wild foods and early cultivation, before maize arrived in the Ohio Valley, was nutritionally adequate and probably more diverse than the diet of many contemporary agricultural societies. The stable isotope evidence from Hopewell skeletons suggests that most individuals were well nourished, without the signs of nutritional stress that appear in the skeletons of early agricultural populations in the region where maize monoculture led to a narrower diet. The Hopewell people were not desperate for food. They were managing a productive mixed economy that gave them the flexibility to invest significant collective effort in the construction and maintenance of the great earthwork complexes. By the Mississippian period, maize had become central to the diet, and the consequences of that transition are visible in the skeletal record. Mississippian skeletons show more dental caries than Hopewell skeletons, a reflection of the higher sugar content of a maize-dominant diet. They show more signs of nutritional stress, including evidence of iron deficiency anemia in some populations. But the maize economy also supported a much larger population, and the caloric abundance of good harvest years allowed the accumulation of the surplus that funded the complex political and ceremonial system of the Mississippian world. The management of the food supply was therefore a political act in the Mississippian world, as it is in every complex society. The paramount chief's ability to control the distribution of food surplus was one of the foundations of political power. The great storehouses that archaeology has found associated with platform mounds at Mississippian sites were not just practical facilities. They were symbols of the chief's ability to provide for the community, to buffer it against the lean years that inevitably came, to receive the tribute of surrounding communities, and redistribute it in ways that reinforced political relationships and obligations. Control of the granary was control of the political system. This political economy was embedded in the ceremonial system in ways that made it feel less like coercion and more like cosmic order. The first fruit ceremony, in which the new harvest was dedicated to the community before any individual could consume it, and in which the paramount chief's household received the first and finest of the harvest, was both a religious practice and a political mechanism. It expressed the cosmological relationship between the chief, who mediated between the community and the cosmic powers that controlled fertility and weather, and the community, who depended on that mediation for their agricultural success. It was also a system of tribute collection dressed in the language of cosmic obligation. The two things were genuinely inseparable in the Mississippian understanding of the world, and that inseparability was a feature of the system rather than a bug. The feasting that accompanied the great ceremonial events at Cahokia and at other Mississippian centers was another dimension of this political economy. Archaeological evidence of large-scale feasting in the form of enormous quantities of food remains in specific contexts, has been found at Cahokia and at several other Mississippian sites. The feasting events were opportunities for the paramount to demonstrate generosity, to distribute wealth and food to the gathered communities in ways that reinforced relationships of obligation and loyalty. They were also occasions for the performance of the ceremonies that validated the political order, for the public display of the prestige objects that marked the elite, and for the negotiation of the political alliances and marriage arrangements that integrated the regional polity. This is political theatre in the fullest sense, and the earthwork plazas and the great platform mounds were its stage. The design of the Mississippian Civic and Ceremonial Center was a political design as well as a cosmological one, a spatial arrangement that organized the community's political life in ways that expressed and reinforced the hierarchical order. The paramount at the top of the mound, literally elevated above the community gathered in the plaza below, performing the ceremonies that connected the human world to the cosmic powers, distributing food from the storehouses that expressed the community's dependence on leadership. This was how power was made visible and made legitimate in the Mississippian world. Understanding this does not diminish the achievement. Every complex society produces its own forms of political theatre, its own ways of making power visible and legitimate. The interesting question is not whether the Mississippian political system involved the manipulation of symbols and ceremonies in the service of power, because of course it did. The interesting question is what it tells us about the specific values and the specific understanding of the cosmos that the Mississippian political system embodied, and how that understanding was different from and similar to the political theologies of other complex societies in other parts of the world. The similarities are striking in some respects. The divine chief, the ceremonial center that expresses the community's relationship to the cosmos, the management of food surplus as a political tool, the use of exotic materials as markers of elite status, the feasting and redistribution events that reinforce political relationships. All of these appear in complex societies across the world and across history. The human political imagination, it seems, keeps arriving at similar solutions to the problem of how to organize large groups of people under hierarchical authority. But the specifics of the Mississippian version of these solutions are shaped by the specific ecological, social, and cosmological conditions of the central Mississippi Valley, and those specifics are worth attending to carefully. The Mississippian cosmos was organized around the relationship between the world above and the world below, between the sky powers and the underwater powers, and the human world inhabited the middle space between these two realms. The paramount chief's connection to the sky world through the elevation of the platform mound was complemented by the community's connection to the underwater world through the ceremonial use of marine shells and through the imagery of the underwater panther and the horned serpent that appears throughout the Mississippian visual tradition. This vertical cosmology, with the human world at the center of a tiered universe, is not unique to the Mississippian world. It appears in many indigenous North American traditions and in many of the world's religious systems more broadly. But the specific Mississippian version of it, expressed in the specific forms of the earthworks and the ceramics and the shell gorgets, and the copper-covered wooden objects that survive in burial contexts, is a genuine intellectual achievement, a coherent and sophisticated cosmological system that provided the people of the Mississippian world with a comprehensive understanding of their place in the universe and their relationship to the powers that shaped their lives. This cosmological system did not disappear with the decline of the Mississippian urban centers. It transformed, adapted, continued. The communities that dispersed from Cahokia and from the other large Mississippian centers in the 14th and 15th centuries took the cosmological framework with them, and they continue to express it in the ceremonies and the oral traditions and the material culture of their post-Cahokian lives. The communities that the Europeans encountered in the 16th and 17th centuries were not post-civilizational remnants, people who had once been part of a great civilization and had since declined into simplicity. They were communities that had adapted their social and political organization to new ecological and historical conditions, while maintaining the essential intellectual and ceremonial framework that had structured the Mississippian world. The Europeans who encountered them, with very few exceptions, were not able to see this. They saw smaller communities, less impressive architecture, less hierarchical political organization than at the height of the Mississippian period, and they concluded that they were looking at simple peoples who had never achieved anything more complex. The framework that would have allowed them to understand what they were looking at, the understanding that these communities were the inheritors of a millennia-long civilizational tradition that had adapted and continued rather than collapsed and ended, was not available to them. It is barely available to us now, 4 centuries later, despite all the archaeology and all the oral history and all the collaborative research that has been done. But it is becoming more available. The work of scholars like Timothy Porketat, whose careful, rigorous archaeology of Cahokia has consistently pushed for a recognition of the full complexity and sophistication of the Mississippian world, has been important. The work of LaDonna Harris and other indigenous scholars who have written about the political and philosophical traditions of the peoples whose ancestors built the mounds has been important. The collaborative projects that bring academic archaeologists and indigenous community members together around the shared work of understanding specific sites have been important. The legal and political developments that have returned some decision-making authority over earthwork sites to the descendant communities have been important. And the stories have been important. The long, slow, patient work of telling this story in ways that reach people who were not taught it in school, who encounter it for the first time in a documentary, or a podcast, or a video, or a museum visit, or a walk through a state park where the mounds are still visible in the landscape. That work is happening, and it is reaching people, and the people it reaches are changed by it in ways that matter. You are one of those people, now. If you have listened this far, you know something about the mound builders and the world they built that you did not know when you began. You know that the tradition began more than 5,000 years ago and continued until European contact and continues in transformed forms even now. You know that it was continental in scale, connecting communities from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian Shield in networks of trade and ceremony and relationship. You know that the great earthwork complexes encode astronomical knowledge of a sophistication that impressed modern engineers when they analyzed it. You know that the descendants of the builders are still here, still carrying the traditions and the knowledge and the connection to the landscape that built the mounds, and still working to have those traditions and that connection recognized and honored. And you know that the story you were taught, the story in which the pre-Columbian history of North America is a blank space, or a collection of simple societies, or an archaeological footnote, is wrong. It is wrong not as a matter of opinion or interpretation, but as a matter of documented, measurable, archaeological fact. The mound-building world was real. It was complex. It was sophisticated. It was built by human beings of the same cognitive capacity and the same range of human possibility that we possess. And it was the world that was here when the Europeans arrived, or rather the remnant of it was here, the transformation of it was here, the continuation of it was here, and the communities that carried it were doing their best to maintain it in the face of the catastrophe that European contact represented. That catastrophe is part of the story too, and it cannot be told honestly without acknowledging the scale of the loss. The epidemics that preceded formal European contact in many regions of North America, spread by the biological vectors that Europeans carried without knowing it, killed people in numbers that are almost impossible to fully comprehend. In some regions, mortality estimates run to 80 or 90% of the pre-contact population within the first century of European arrival. The communities that survived those epidemics were not the communities that had existed before them. They were drastically reduced in number, often relocated, often having lost most of the elders who carried the most detailed and specialized ceremonial and practical knowledge, operating under conditions of crisis that made the maintenance of complex ceremonial and political traditions extremely difficult. The mound-building tradition did not survive those epidemics intact. Much of the most detailed knowledge associated with specific sites and specific ceremonies was lost when the communities that held it were reduced to a fraction of their pre-contact size, and when the social structures that transmitted that knowledge were disrupted beyond repair. What survived was the framework, the essential structure of the cosmological system, and the basic practices of the ceremonial tradition carried forward by communities that maintained what they could in the face of conditions that made it impossible to maintain everything. The survival of that framework, across 4 centuries of epidemic disease and warfare, and forced relocation and active suppression of ceremonial practices by colonial authorities and missionary pressure, is itself a remarkable achievement, a testament to the depth and the resilience of the tradition. And it means that the story is not over. The tradition that built the mounds is still alive. The communities that carry it are still present, still working to maintain it, still teaching their children the elements of a worldview and a relationship to the land that goes back thousands of years. The earthworks are still in the landscape, still aligned to the sun and the moon, still encoding in their geometry the knowledge that was pressed into the earth by the communities that built them. The story is continuing, transformed by the 4 centuries of catastrophe and resistance and adaptation that have intervened, but still recognizably the same story that began at Watson Break more than 5,000 years ago. That continuity is what the lie in the textbook was designed to sever. The lost race theory, the narrative in which the mounds were built by mysterious vanished people who had nothing to do with the current inhabitants of the land, was not just bad archaeology. It was an attempt to cut the thread between the mound-building tradition and its living heirs, to make it impossible to recognize the communities of the present as the inheritors of the world that the earthworks represent. If the thread is severed, the earthworks become archaeological curiosities, impressive but orphaned, belonging to no one in particular, and therefore belonging to whoever wants to claim them. If the thread is intact, the earthworks are the heritage of specific living communities, and those communities have claims on them that archaeology and the law and simple human decency all need to honor. The thread is intact. The lie did not work, not completely. The communities are still here, the traditions are still alive, and the story of the mound builders, the real story, the one that connects the Watson Break mounds of 5,000 years ago to the Serpent Mounds of Ontario, to the Great Hopewell enclosures to Cahokia, to the Muskogee Square ground ceremonies of the present, is a continuous story, and it is being told with increasing clarity and increasing reach by the scholars and the community members and the documentary makers and the curriculum developers who are committed to getting it right. You are part of that story now. You have heard it. You carry it. What you do with it is up to you. The night is quiet. The mounds are standing. The traditions are alive. The story goes on. If you are still awake at the end of this, then something kept you here. Some question or some recognition or some feeling that this is important in a way that is hard to articulate but easy to feel. Trust that feeling. It is pointing at something real. The world is older and stranger and more interesting than most of us were taught, and the people who inhabited it before us understood things about it that we have largely lost. Getting those things back, or at least getting closer to them, is one of the more worthwhile projects a human being can undertake. The subscribe button is there if you want more of this. The comment section is there if you want to tell me where you are and what this brought up for you. The reading list is there. Timothy Porketa on Cahokia, the published oral traditions of the Muskogee and the Osage and the Choctaw and the Haudenosaunee, the archaeological literature on Hopewell and Poverty Point and Watson Brake, all of it waiting to take you deeper into the story. And the earthworks themselves are there, in Ohio and Illinois and Louisiana and Ontario and Alberta and Wisconsin and a dozen other places, waiting for you to come and stand in them and look up at the same sky. The builders watched and feel across the distance of time the presence of the people who pressed this knowledge into the earth. The mounds are still standing, the traditions are still alive, the story is still being told. Sleep well, or go find the earthworks. Both are the right thing to do. Let us spend some time with a question that gets raised occasionally by people who have heard parts of this story and who want to understand it more deeply. And that is the question of why. Not why the mounds were built, which is a question about function and intention that we have addressed at some length, but why the mound building tradition, once it developed, persisted and spread and intensified across 4,000 years and an enormous geographic range. Why it captured the imagination and the collective effort of so many different communities in so many different ecological and social contexts. Because the tradition did not just survive, it thrived. It produced successive waves of innovation and elaboration that culminated in Cahokia, one of the most ambitious urban experiments in the pre-modern world. What was it about earthwork construction that made it such a persistent and compelling response to the human need for a relationship with the land and the cosmos? Part of the answer is practical. Earthworks are durable. They outlast almost every other material that pre-technological societies can work with. Wood rots, organic materials decay. Stone, in the forms available in most of the eastern half of North America, is hard to quarry and transport without metal tools. But earth is everywhere. It can be shaped with the most basic tools, and shaped earth lasts. A well-constructed earthen mound can survive thousands of years with minimal maintenance, and the great Hopewell and Mississippian earthworks have in fact survived thousands of years, which is why we are still talking about them. The choice of earth as the primary building material was not a limitation imposed by technological backwardness. It was a genuinely rational choice, given the available materials and the desired durability of the result. But durability alone does not explain the persistence of the tradition. Stone is also durable, and yet the mound-building world never developed the kind of stone monumental architecture that characterizes the great civilizations of the Old World and of Mesoamerica. The preference for earth over stone reflects something about the relationship to the land that the mound-building tradition embodied. Earth is not a neutral material. It comes from the specific landscape where the earthwork is being built. The earth that makes up a mound is the earth of that particular valley, that particular ridge, that particular bend in the river. Building with it is an act of taking the landscape and shaping it into something that expresses the community's relationship to that landscape, of making the land itself into a monument. This is a fundamentally different approach to monumental architecture than the one that uses stone quarried from a distance or clay fired in a kiln. Building with local earth is a statement about rootedness, about the deep connection between the community and the specific place where it lives. The mound is not brought from somewhere else and placed on the landscape. The mound is made from the landscape itself, and in making it, the community is participating in the landscape in a way that expresses their relationship to it more fully than any imported material could. This understanding of earthwork construction as a form of intimate participation in the landscape connects the mound-building tradition to a broader set of values and practices that characterize the relationship between the Moose, communities of pre-Columbian North America, and the environments they inhabited. These were not communities that understood themselves as separate from and superior to the natural world. They were communities that understood themselves as participants in a web of relationships that included the land, the water, the sky, the plants, the animals, and the ancestral dead who were embedded in the landscape through their burial mounds. The earthworks were one expression of that participatory relationship, one way of marking and maintaining the community's connection to the cosmos and to the specific place that the community called home. The persistence of the tradition across 4,000 years and enormous geographic distances also reflects the way ideas and practices spread through the networks of trade and ceremony and personal relationship that connected the communities of pre-Columbian North America. When a community participated in the Hopewell Exchange Network, it was not just getting access to exotic materials. It was participating in a shared ceremonial and cosmological framework that gave those materials their meaning. The copper ear spool in an Ohio burial was not just an impressive piece of metalwork. It was an object that expressed a specific set of relationships between the individual and the community, between the living and the ancestors, between the human world and the cosmic powers. That was part of the shared Hopewell framework. By participating in that framework, by accepting the materials and the practices and the cosmological understanding that went with them, communities across a vast geographic range were expressing their connection to a shared tradition. And that shared tradition, maintained through the exchange networks and the ceremonial relationships and the personal connections formed at the great gathering places, was the social infrastructure that made the mound-building world coherent across its enormous scale. The Hopewell interaction sphere is sometimes described as a religion, but that framing is not quite right. It was more like a civilization in the sense that the word is used when we talk about Western civilization or Islamic civilization, a broad cultural framework that encompassed many different local traditions and many different political structures, but that provided a shared set of values, a shared cosmological understanding, and a shared set of practices that made communication and exchange and mutual recognition possible across enormous distances and many generations. The mound builders were participants in that civilization, building its monuments, maintaining its ceremonies, transmitting its knowledge, and adapting it to their specific local conditions. They were not passive recipients of a tradition imposed from outside. They were active contributors to it, adding their own innovations and their own understandings to a shared framework that grew richer and more complex with each generation's contribution. When we talk about the mound builders as if they were a single people, we are doing them a disservice. There were many peoples, speaking many languages, living in many different ecological settings, organized in many different political ways, expressing the shared tradition of earthwork construction in many different local forms. The Adena people of the Ohio Valley were not the same as the Poverty Point people of Louisiana, who were not the same as the Hopewell people of Illinois, who were not the same as the Mississippian people of the American Bottom. They were participants in a shared tradition, connected by trade and ceremony and shared cosmological frameworks. But each community was also a specific people with its own language, its own history, its own relationship to its own landscape, its own local expressions of the shared tradition. This diversity is one of the most important things about the mound-building world, and it is one of the things that the lost race theory most completely erases. The lost race theory imagined the mound builders as a single people, a unified civilization that had risen and fallen in a mysterious prehistoric past. But the reality was a diverse, dynamic, internally varied tradition that developed and changed across 4,000 years and produced an enormous range of earthwork forms and social organizations and ceremonial practices, connected by shared networks and shared frameworks, but never unified into a single political or cultural entity. That diversity is still present in the communities that carry the tradition forward. The Muskogee and the Choctaw and the Cherokee and the Osage and the Ojibwe and the Haudenosaunee and the many other nations whose ancestors participated in the mound-building tradition are not the same people. They have their own specific histories, their own specific relationships to their own specific landscapes, their own specific expressions of values and practices that have roots in the broader tradition. Treating them as undifferentiated representatives of a single pre-Columbian past is just as wrong as treating the mound builders as a single lost race. The right approach is the approach that the collaborative archaeology is beginning to take, engaging with each specific community on its own terms, listening to its specific traditions and its specific knowledge of its specific landscape, and treating that specificity as evidence rather than noise. The full picture of the mound-building world will emerge not from finding the single correct story, but from assembling the many specific, local, particular stories that make up the full diversity of the tradition. That full picture is still being assembled. It will not be complete in our lifetimes, or probably in the lifetimes of our children. The archaeology is ongoing. The oral history projects are ongoing. The legal and political negotiations about the stewardship of earthwork sites are ongoing. The curriculum revisions are ongoing. The slow, difficult work of changing the default assumptions that most people bring to the pre-Columbian history of North America is ongoing. But the direction is clear. The story is being told more honestly and more completely than it has ever been told before. The communities that carry the tradition are being recognized as the rightful interpreters of that tradition more consistently than at any previous point in the post-contact period. The earthworks are being protected and studied and interpreted with more care and more sophistication than at any point in the past 2 centuries. The truth, patient as the mounds themselves, is slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably making its way to the surface. The mounds are monuments to the human capacity for vision, for sustained collective effort, for the building of things that outlast individual lives and connect individual communities to something larger than themselves. They are also monuments to the specific understanding of the cosmos and the land, and the community that the mound-building peoples brought to the work of building them, an understanding that deserves to be recognized and honored, not as a curiosity from the pre-Columbian past, but as a living intellectual tradition that still has things to teach us about what it means to inhabit a landscape with care, and intention, and long-term vision. The version in the textbooks is a lie. The truth is that the mound builders built one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, right here on this continent, across thousands of years of continuous development, and their descendants are still here, carrying that tradition forward. The earthworks are the evidence. The oral traditions are the evidence. The continuity of the ceremonial and philosophical framework across centuries of disruption and transformation is the evidence. The living communities that maintain their connection to the earthwork landscape are the evidence. You have heard the evidence tonight. What you do with it is the question that the mounds, patient and persistent in the landscape, are always asking of the people who walk past them. The question that they have been asking for 1,000 and 2,000 and 5,000 years. The question that will be asked if we take care of them for thousands of years to come. Take care of them. Listen to the people who know them. Tell the story when you have the chance. And rest now, in the knowledge that the earth beneath you is older and richer and more storied than most people know, and that the story of what was built on it and who built it and what they understood about this place is one of the most extraordinary stories in the long history of human beings making meaning on this planet. The mounds are standing, the traditions are alive, the story goes on. There is one more thread in this story that we have not yet followed to its end, and it is the thread that runs from the deep past of the mound builders directly to the present moment of the communities that carry their heritage, through the specific and often painful history of what happened to those communities in the centuries after European contact. Because the story of the mound builders is not complete without the story of what was done to the world they built. And understanding what was done is essential to understanding what is still being repaired. The Spanish entrada into the southeast in the 16th century encountered a world still organized in significant ways around the Mississippian framework. Hernando de Soto's expedition from 1539 to 1542 passed through dozens of Mississippian towns, many of them organized around central mounds with the residences of chiefs on top and the public plazas at the foot. De Soto's chroniclers describe ceremonies and political protocols and the physical form of the communities they visited in ways that are consistent with what archaeology reveals about the late Mississippian period. They describe a world that was complex and politically sophisticated, organized around recognized leaders with authority over surrounding territories, capable of mobilizing significant numbers of warriors and of producing the food surplus that the Spanish expedition required to sustain itself. The encounters were often violent, because the Spanish demanded submission and tribute that the Mississippian communities had no reason to give, and because the Spanish were willing and able to use extreme violence to enforce their demands. But the violence of the De Soto expedition, horrific as it was not the primary driver of the transformation that followed. The primary driver was invisible, carried in the bodies of the European soldiers and the animals they brought with them, spreading from community to community through trade networks and personal contact, killing people who had no immunity to the diseases that the Europeans had been living with for generations. The epidemic waves that followed European contact in the southeast are among the most devastating demographic catastrophes in human history. Estimates of pre-contact population in the southeast range from 1 to 3 million people. By the early 18th century, after roughly a century and a half of epidemic disease, the population had fallen to perhaps a tenth of that. The Mississippian chiefdoms that De Soto had encountered, many of them apparently intact and politically functional, were in ruins within a generation of his passage, destroyed not by direct military conquest, but by the biological consequences of contact with Europeans. The communities that survived those initial waves of epidemic disease were reorganized, reduced, relocated communities, doing their best to maintain cultural continuity under conditions of catastrophic disruption. The elaborate ceremonial systems that required large specialized populations of practitioners to maintain became harder to sustain when the total population had fallen by 80 or 90%. The political structures that depended on the management of agricultural surplus and the maintenance of tribute relationships across a regional polity became harder to sustain when the populations that had participated in those relationships were gone. The trade networks that had connected communities across the continent contracted as the communities at the nodes of the network were reduced or eliminated. But the communities survived. The Muskogee Creek, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Natchez, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami, the Ojibwe, and their many related and allied peoples, all of them survived the epidemics and the subsequent centuries of warfare and colonial pressure and forced relocation, maintaining the essential elements of their cultural identity across conditions that would have destroyed less resilient traditions. The ceremonies continued, in modified forms. The oral traditions were maintained. The relationships to the specific landscapes that were their homelands continued to be expressed in the practices and the knowledge systems of the communities that maintained those relationships. The forced relocations of the 19th century, the Indian removal era in the United States and the reserve system in Canada were the next wave of catastrophic disruption. The removal of the southeastern nations to Indian territory in the 1830s physically separated communities from the specific landscapes they had inhabited for generations, from the earthwork sites that were embedded in their oral traditions and ceremonial practices, from the ecological knowledge that was tied to specific rivers and forests and mountains. The communities that survived the Trail of Tears and the other forced marches of the removal era arrived in Indian territory as communities in crisis, dealing with the trauma of displacement on top of the accumulated trauma of the epidemics and the wars and the land seizures that had preceded it. In Canada, the reserve system confined Indigenous communities to fractions of their traditional territories, disrupting the seasonal movement patterns that had organized their economies and ceremonial lives for centuries, restricting access to the specific sites and resources that were essential to their cultural and spiritual practices. The residential school system, which removed children from their families and communities and prohibited the use of Indigenous languages and the practice of Indigenous ceremonies, attacked the transmission of cultural knowledge at its most fundamental level, trying to sever the connection between the communities and the traditions that had sustained them across centuries. These systems were not fully successful in destroying Indigenous cultures, but they caused enormous damage that is still being repaired. The interruption of ceremonial transmission across generations created gaps in the knowledge base that were difficult or impossible to fully repair. The suppression of languages reduced the ability to maintain the oral traditions in their full complexity, because much of the cultural knowledge embedded in those traditions is expressed in ways that do not translate fully into other languages. The removal of communities from their traditional territories disrupted the embodied knowledge of specific landscapes that was essential to the ecological and ceremonial practices tied to those landscapes. The healing of this damage is one of the central projects of the indigenous communities of North America in the present, and it is directly connected to the story of the mound builders and the earthwork landscape. Language revitalization programs are recovering the indigenous languages that carry the oral traditions. Ceremonial revitalization programs are recovering the knowledge of ceremonies that were suppressed or interrupted. Land rights struggles are working to restore the relationship between communities and the specific landscapes that are embedded in their traditions. Repatriation efforts are working to return the human remains and sacred objects that were removed from the earthwork sites to the communities that have the right to care for them. All of this work is the continuation of the same story that began at Watson Break more than 5,000 years ago. The tradition of earthwork construction and the cosmological and social framework that it expressed were not a brief episode in the history of North America that ended before European contact. They were, and they are, a living tradition that has been maintained across thousands of years of change and disruption and adaptation, and that continues to evolve and express itself in the lives of the communities that carry it. Recognizing this, fully and honestly and with the implications that the recognition carries, is what it means to take the mound building heritage seriously. It means recognizing that the earthworks are not orphaned monuments belonging to no one in particular. They are the heritage of specific living communities, and those communities have rights and responsibilities with respect to them that archaeology and the law and simple human decency all need to honor. It means recognizing that the story of the mound builders is not a story about the past. It is a story about the present, about who is here now and what they carry and what they are working to maintain and recover and transmit to the generations that come after them. The earthworks endure, the traditions continue, the communities are present, and the story, the real story, the one the mounds have been trying to tell for thousands of years, is finally being heard in something closer to its full truth. That is where we leave it tonight. Not at an ending, because the story is not ending, but at a pause, a resting place in the long journey of this tradition, a moment to take stock of what has been said and what it means, and what it asks of the people who have heard it. The mounds are standing, the traditions are alive, the story goes on, and you have been listening. Rest now, the earth remembers. Before you drift fully into sleep, let one more thing settle into you. The persistence of these traditions across 5,000 years is not an accident. It is not the inertia of cultures that failed to change. It is the achievement of communities that understood what was worth preserving and developed the practices and the institutions and the relationships necessary to preserve it. The knowledge encoded in the earthwork landscapes of North America, the astronomical knowledge and the ecological knowledge, and the cosmological understanding and the political philosophy is worth preserving. It was worth preserving 5,000 years ago, when the first mounds were constructed at Watson Break. It was worth preserving 2,000 years ago, when the Hopewell communities were building the great enclosures of the Ohio Valley. It was worth preserving 1,000 years ago, when the Mississippian builders were raising Monk's Mound above the American bottom. And it is worth preserving today, when the communities that carry it are working to maintain and recover and transmit it in the face of all the pressures that continue to work against them. What you have heard tonight is a fragment of that preserved knowledge, filtered through the imperfect medium of an outsider telling a story that ultimately belongs to the communities that lived it and live it still. The full knowledge is held by those communities, in their languages and their ceremonies and their relationships to their specific landscapes. If what you heard tonight makes you want to go deeper, the path leads through the work of the scholars and the community members who are bringing that knowledge to wider audiences, through the oral traditions and the collaborative archaeological research and the community-led interpretation programs at the earthwork sites themselves. The tradition built things that lasted. It built earthworks that are still in the landscape after 5,000 years. It built cosmological frameworks and social institutions that have persisted through centuries of the most intense disruption. And it built the human communities that carry all of this forward, that are still here, still working, still maintaining the connections that the mounds were built to express. That is the real answer to the question the textbooks got wrong. The mound builders are not a mystery. They are not a lost civilization. They are not a vanished people. They are the ancestors of communities that are still present, still carrying their traditions, still connected to the landscapes their ancestors shaped. The lie in the textbook was always a lie about the present as much as about the past, a refusal to see the living continuities that connect the earthwork traditions of the pre-Columbian world to the indigenous communities of today. The truth sees those continuities, the truth honors them, and the truth says that the story of what was here before the story we were taught is not over. It is still being lived, and it is still being told, and you have been listening. Sleep well. One final thought, before the words give way to silence, and the story becomes whatever you carry with you into the night. The earthworks of North America were not built by people trying to impress the future. They were not monuments to the ambition of rulers who wanted to be remembered. They were expressions of a relationship. The relationship between a community and the land it lived on, and the sky it moved under, and the ancestors it was descended from, and the generations that would come after it. They were ways of making that relationship visible, durable, legible across time. They were, in the deepest sense, love letters to the land, written in earth, because earth lasts. The people who wrote them are not gone. The relationship they expressed is not severed. The earth that carries the marks they pressed into it is still here, still holding the memory of what was built on it and why. And when you lie down to sleep tonight, wherever you are lying on land that has its own history, its own memory, its own story of the people who lived on it before you, and the things they built, and the knowledge they encoded in the landscape. Most of us do not know those stories. Most of us were never taught them, but they are there, waiting, patient as the mounds, ready to be heard by anyone willing to listen. You have been listening. That matters. Rest now. The silence after a long story is its own kind of meaning. It is the space where what you have heard settles into the part of you that was made to hold it. The part that is older than the name you were given, older than the language you are thinking in, older than the particular arrangement of land and water and sky that you call home. The part that recognizes something true when it hears it, even when the thing it recognizes is very old and very far from the world you usually inhabit. That part of you has been listening tonight to a story about the world you actually live in, not the simplified version that begins in 1492 or some other convenient starting point that erases everything that came before, but the real version, the one that goes back 5,000 years and keeps going. The mounds are part of that story. The traditions that built them are part of that story. The communities that carry those traditions forward are part of that story. And now, in some small way, so are you. Take that forward. Let it change something in the way you look at the land under your feet and the sky over your head and the long human history of this place that most of us were never taught to see. The mounds are still there. The traditions are still alive. The story is still being told. And tonight, in the quiet, you have been part of it. Good night. The mounds are standing, and the earth remembers, and the story is alive, and it was always yours to hear. The earth that was here before us knows what was built on it, and it will carry that knowledge long after we are gone. That is not a mystical claim. It is a simple geological and archaeological fact. The earth holds all of it. Rest now, and sleep well.